He sent the photo at 11:47 p.m. He didn't mean to. That's what he would tell himself later, in the car, in the rain, with his hands shaking against the steering wheel. He meant to send it to his deputy. A simple message. Meeting went well, closing the Yoon deal tomorrow. And the photo, just proof he'd been working, not disappearing into Seoul's nightlife the way Nia sometimes feared. But the name his thumb selected wasn't Park Sung-min. It was Nia, his pregnant wife, 8 months along, alone in their penthouse on the 34th floor while he sat on a rain-slicked rooftop with a woman she'd never met, both of them leaning close enough that the camera caught Yoon Seo-rin's hand on his arm and his smile, easy, unguarded, the smile Nia hadn't seen in months. The read receipt appeared in 4 seconds. Kang Do-jin stared at his phone and felt, for the first time in 20 years, genuinely afraid. If you've ever made a mistake you couldn't take back, a single second that rewrote everything, then you already understand what this story is about. Not about power, not about crime. About a man who had everything, lost the only thing that mattered, and had to decide whether he was willing to bleed for it. Hit that like button right now if you're staying until the end. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the stories we tell on this channel don't let go of you easily. This is part 1. The rain had been coming down since 9 o'clock. The kind of heavy soul rain that turns every streetlight into a smear of color against wet asphalt. Do-jin had been on the rooftop terrace of Club Hanol for 2 hours, working through the Yoon Seo-rin negotiation, the way he worked through everything, methodically, patiently, keeping his real intentions behind a mask of casual conversation. Seo-rin was good. He had to give her that. She was 34, sharp-faced, the kind of woman who had learned early that in rooms full of men like Do-jin, you either became invisible or you became indispensable. She'd chosen indispensable. Her nightclub operation ran clean on the surface, investors, licenses, event bookings, and dirty underneath, which was exactly why the Baeko Syndicate had flagged her as a potential partner for the rooftop casino expansion. She understood money laundering the way some people understand a second language. Fluent, without thinking about it. Do-jin didn't like her exactly, but he respected competence. They'd been drinking. Not heavily. He never drank heavily in business meetings, an old rule he'd kept since his 20s, but enough that the edges of the conversation had softened. Seo-rin had pushed him twice about commitment levels. Both times he'd deflected. The third time she'd leaned back in her chair, studied him with that calculating look that reminded him uncomfortably of himself, and said, "You know what your people say about you?" "Many things," Do-jin said. "They say you never make mistakes." She tilted her head. "I'm starting to think that's true. You're very careful, Mr. Kang. Very controlled." A pause. "Almost like you have something to hide." It was a provocation, an obvious one. He knew it was an obvious one. He still felt it land somewhere beneath his sternum. "I have nothing to hide," he said. She smiled. "Then take a photo with me. Show your people the boss is comfortable doing business with a woman. Kill the rumor mill before it starts." He should have said no. He'd said no to 100 things sharper than this. Instead, he'd thought about the meeting he needed to close, the territory implications if Seo-rin walked, the 3 weeks of preparation his team had put into this negotiation. He'd thought briefly and distantly, the way a man thinks of things he's filed under-handled, about Nia upstairs in their penthouse, 8 months along, probably asleep. He'd pulled out his phone. Seo-rin had moved her chair closer. Her hand had settled on his forearm. Professional, light, the kind of contact that means nothing in a boardroom. The camera clicked. She'd looked satisfied. He'd looked relaxed in a way he hadn't looked in months, because for those 2 hours he'd been the boss instead of the husband, and the boss was always easier. He typed the message to Park Sung-min. Closing the Yoon deal tomorrow. Meeting went well. He attached the photo. He hit send. And then he looked down at his phone and saw, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that the message thread above the attachment was not the gray-bubbled professional exchanges with his deputy. It was the gold-hearted thread he'd had with Nia since the day he'd bought her that ridiculous oversized phone because she kept squinting at her old one. The thread where her last message, sent 3 hours ago, read, "Baby kicked again. Feels like she's practicing taekwondo. Come home soon." The photo had delivered. The read receipt appeared. Dojin sat very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then he stood, dropped 200,000 won on the table without explanation, told Seorin the meeting was concluded, and walked to the elevator. He called Nia before the doors closed. No answer. He called again in the lobby. No answer. He was in his car and moving before his driver had fully processed the instruction, weaving through late-night Seoul traffic with the kind of controlled urgency that his enemies sometimes described as the scariest thing about him. The fact that Kang Dojin moved faster when he was frightened than when he was angry. He called 3 more times. Nothing. The penthouse was lit when he arrived. All of it. Every room. Nia sometimes did that when she couldn't sleep, turned on lights the way other people turned on music. He noticed it from the parking structure and felt the first crack open in his chest. Park Sung-min was waiting at the elevator. Dojin hadn't called him, which meant Sung-min had been monitoring Nia's security detail the way he always did, quietly and without being asked, because he was the kind of deputy who understood that some jobs don't appear on the official list. She's still inside, Sung-min said. She hasn't called anyone. Leave. Boss, I said leave. Sung-min stepped back. Dojin took the elevator up alone. The penthouse smelled like the ginger tea Nia had been drinking for weeks, the one her OB had recommended for the nausea that still hit her some evenings. He registered that smell the way he registered everything, automatically, filed, processed. He walked through the entrance hall and stopped. She was in the kitchen. Standing at the marble island, still in the oversized gray cardigan she'd been wearing when he left, her hands flat on the counter. She wasn't crying. He almost would have preferred crying. Nia's face when she was past crying was something he'd only seen twice in 4 years of marriage, and both times it had taken him weeks to understand the full weight of what he'd caused. She was looking at her phone, at the photo. She didn't look up when he walked in. Nia. His voice came out wrong, too careful. The voice he used in negotiations, and he hated himself immediately for it. I know what you're going to say. Her voice was quiet, not shaking. That was worse. It was an accident. You meant to send it to someone else. She's just business. Nothing happened. Nothing happened, he said. She's an investor. It was a business meeting. The photo, I know nothing happened. She looked up then. Her eyes were dry, and that was the worst thing he'd ever seen in his life. Dojin, I know you. I know when you're lying and I know when you're not. I believe you that nothing happened. He exhaled. But that's not the point, she said, and the exhale became nothing. She turned the phone so he could see the photo. Seorin's hand on his arm, his smile. The ease of a man who felt comfortable and present and alive, at 11:30 at night, on a rooftop with a woman who wasn't his wife. When did you last smile at me like that? Nia asked. He opened his mouth. Don't answer, she said. I'm not asking because I want you to explain. I'm asking because I've been asking myself that question for 6 months, and I finally stopped pretending I didn't know the answer. Dojin crossed the kitchen toward her. She didn't move away. That wasn't Nia. She was never someone who flinched. But she looked at him with something so exhausted and so clear that he stopped 3 feet away without meaning to. I'm tired, she said. I don't mean tonight. I mean, I am tired in my bones of being the person who stays home and waits and tells herself the meetings matter, the territory matters, the syndicate matters, because she loves you. Her hand moved to her stomach, automatic, protective. I used to believe that you'd get through whatever this phase was, that one day you'd look at me the way you looked at me when I told you we were pregnant and you cried. You actually cried, Dojin, and I'd know we were still us. He remembered that night. He remembered exactly where he'd been standing. We're still us, he said. No, she said. We're not. I don't know who we are anymore. I know who you are. You're the boss. You're Kang Dojin of the Byakuo Syndicate, and you're very good at it, and I have watched you become more of that person every month for the last 2 years, until I started feeling like a piece of furniture in this apartment. Beautiful. Expensive. Here when you come home. The words hit differently than accusations would have. An accusation he could argue against. Nia, I need you to leave the room, she said. I need you to go somewhere that isn't here while I figure out what to do. You're 8 months pregnant. It's midnight. I'm not leaving tonight, she said. I'm asking you to give me space in my own home. Can you do that? He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze with a steadiness that he recognized as the particular courage of someone who has already made a decision and is waiting to find out if she'll have to act on it. He went to the guest room. He didn't sleep. At 6 in the morning, he came back. The kitchen was empty. The bedroom was empty. Her hospital bag, the one they'd packed together 3 weeks ago, joking about what snacks to bring, him insisting on the expensive rice crackers, her insisting on peanut butter pretzels, was gone from the closet shelf. On the marble counter, resting against the base of the espresso machine, was her wedding ring. Beside it, folded once, a sheet of paper in her handwriting. He'd seen her handwriting on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the little notes she used to leave in his jacket pocket in the early years, back when they were still finding small ways to reach each other. He unfolded it. 7 words. Our daughter deserves a father who shows up. Below that, a second line, added as an afterthought, or perhaps not an afterthought at all. Perhaps the truest thing in the letter, I hope you find out how. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, long enough that the automatic lights cycled off and he was standing in the gray morning half dark, holding a piece of paper, in a penthouse that suddenly had the particular silence of a place that has stopped being a home. He did not call anyone. He did not send anyone after her. He put the letter in his inside jacket pocket, against his chest, and he stood there until he was sure he understood exactly what he had broken. He found out where she was by noon. Not because he surveilled her, he could have, and the fact that he didn't would matter to him later, become something he held on to as evidence that some part of him had known immediately what kind of man this crisis required him to be. He found out because Nia called Park Sung-min herself and told him directly, with the blunt practicality she'd always had about things she considered facts. She was with her brother. She was safe. She did not want contact. If there was a medical emergency, Sung-min would be notified. That was it. Malcolm Brooks had been in Seoul for 14 months, working private security contracts for foreign executives who needed someone who understood both English-speaking clients and Korean operational environments. He was 6'2", former Marine, the kind of physically present man who did not need to raise his voice to communicate that a conversation was over. Dojin had met him twice. They had been perfectly civil. They had also understood each other completely, the way men who operate in different kinds of danger sometimes do. Malcolm, Dojin knew, would not be moved by any argument that was primarily about Dojin's feelings. He sent no message. He went to his office, and he sat behind his desk and he looked at the city below him. The Han River, the bridges, the glittering arrangement of a Seoul that existed in large part because of money his organization moved through it. And he thought about Nia's face in the kitchen, the dry eyes, the exhausted clarity. When did you last smile at me like that? He tried to remember the last time he'd been genuinely present with her. Not in the room, present. He could recall specific moments from the first year of their marriage. A restaurant where she'd laughed so hard at something he said that she'd knocked over her water glass, and instead of being embarrassed, she'd laughed harder. A Sunday morning walk along the Han when she'd stopped to crouch down and talk to a stray dog for 10 minutes, while he stood there watching her and thought, without irony, that he had done something right. He tried to remember the last Sunday morning walk. He couldn't place it. His phone buzzed. Territory report from the Eastern District. A lieutenant waiting on authorization for a logistics shipment. Seorin's attorney had sent a preliminary agreement draft. He silenced the phone. He sat in his chair until after midnight. The Baeko Syndicate noticed within 72 hours. Not the reason. He hadn't told anyone except Sung-min, and Sung-min understood the particular architecture of discretion that kept organizations like theirs functional. But they noticed the effect. Dojin had always run his empire with the precise, slightly terrifying calm of a man who had never once lost the thread of his own thinking. He was the one who caught the inconsistency in a financial report that 3 accountants had missed. He was the one who read body language in negotiations well enough to know when a partner was lying before the partner knew he'd flinched. That man had gone somewhere. In his place was a Dojin who arrived late to the morning briefing and stared at the far wall while Han Byung-soo, his operations chief, talked through Eastern District logistics, who approved a shipment without reading the full manifest, who, during a meeting with rival faction representatives, missed a deliberate provocation that any of his lieutenants would have caught, and that 6 months ago he would have turned into leverage before the other man finished his sentence. Byung-soo came to his office afterward and closed the door. "You're bleeding," Byung-soo said, not unkindly. He was 61, had been in the organization since before Dojin took leadership, and he spoke with the bluntness of someone who had earned the right. "I'm fine," Dojin said. "You missed the Jian provocation in the meeting today." A pause. "I know. If John's people noticed, I know." Dojin looked up. "How many of our people noticed?" Byung-soo's silence was the answer. Dojin nodded once. "Give me a week." "Boss?" Byung-soo's voice went careful. "Whatever is happening, fix it quickly, or fix it later. But right now, you cannot be distracted. Not with the Yoon deal still open and Jian already testing us." "A week," Dojin repeated. Byung-soo left. Dojin pulled the folded letter from his jacket pocket and read it again. "Our daughter deserves a father who shows up." He had built the Baeko syndicate at 22 years old with nothing but hunger and the particular ruthlessness of a boy who had grown up with so little that taking things stopped feeling wrong. He had turned it into an empire through 20 years of correct decisions made without hesitation. He had never once, in all of that, found a problem he couldn't solve by being smarter and harder and more willing than whoever stood across from him. He had absolutely no idea how to solve this one. And for the first time since he was a teenager standing in an alley without enough money for dinner, Kang Dojin understood what it meant to be genuinely, completely lost. The week Dojin had asked for became 10 days, and in those 10 days the Baeko syndicate ran itself the way a car runs after the engine cuts out. On momentum, on muscle memory, on the collective competence of men who had been trained well enough to function without constant direction. But momentum only carries so far. And the men who circled the edges of Dojin's territory were the kind who could smell the difference between a leader who was busy and a leader who was somewhere else entirely. Han Byung-soo knew this. He said nothing more about it after that first conversation, because he was too experienced to repeat himself and too loyal to let anyone else say it first. But Dojin watched him in the morning briefings. The slight pause before Byung-soo delivered Eastern District numbers. The extra half-second where the old man's eyes moved to Dojin's face to check if the boss was actually in the room, and understood that the clock had started without anyone announcing it. Dojin was running out of time in two directions at once, and he had never before in his life been the cause of his own countdown. He started sleeping at the office, not because the penthouse was unbearable, though it was, in the specific way of large empty spaces that still hold the shape of someone who's left them, but because being there made him useless. He'd walk into the kitchen and stop at the marble counter and stand there long enough that his security details started exchanging glances. He'd sit on the edge of their bed, his bed now, the distinction mattered in ways he hadn't expected, and look at the indentation on her side of the mattress like it was a problem he could solve by staring at it long enough. He couldn't solve it by staring. He couldn't solve it at all, and that was the part that kept arriving fresh every morning like something he hadn't already understood. On the 11th day, her attorneys called. Not Nia directly. Attorneys. A firm out of Gangnam with a reputation for handling high-conflict separations involving significant assets, which told him two things. She had planned this carefully enough to retain counsel before she left, and she was treating this as something that might not resolve itself on its own. The lead attorney was a woman named Choi Yeon-hee, who spoke to Park Sung-min with the kind of controlled professionalism that didn't bother disguising what it was, which was a wall. Sung-min relayed the terms. Dojin listened without interrupting, which Sung-min later said was the most unsettling he'd ever seen the boss behave, because the Dojin he knew would have been 5 sentences ahead, already working the angles. There were 3 conditions before Dojin would have supervised access to the baby after birth. Documented enrollment in individual therapy with a licensed psychiatrist, not a syndicate-affiliated counselor, a verifiable independent practitioner. Surrender of the lead security rotation that had historically surveilled Nia's movements, with written confirmation delivered to her attorneys, and a 48-hour advance notice requirement for any contact attempts to be routed through legal counsel only. No direct calls. No showing up. No using Baeko resources to locate or monitor her. She knows, Dojin said when Sung-min finished. She's always known more than she said, Sung-min replied carefully. The surveillance detail. Dojin looked at his desk. She knew about it. She may have suspected. She knew. He didn't say it with anger. He said it the way he said things when he was assembling a picture and didn't like what it showed. How long do I have to respond to the conditions? 72 hours. He responded in 14. The acceptance letter went through Choi Yeon-hee's office. Straightforward, no negotiation, no counterconditions, which Dojin understood would communicate something on its own, that he wasn't treating this as a power exchange, or at least that he understood the terms well enough to know that treating it as one would cost him everything that still mattered. He fired the surveillance detail that afternoon. 3 men he'd trusted for 6 years. He gave them severance, no discussion, no explanation required. 2 of them nodded and left. The third one, a compact, quiet man named OJ1, who had been specifically assigned to Nia's protection since the first credible threat against the syndicate leadership 2 years ago, stayed in the doorway an extra second. "She was always good to us," Jaewon said. Not an accusation, just a fact he seemed to feel owed acknowledgement. "I know," Dojin said. Jaewon left. Dojin called the psychiatric clinic at Yonsei University Medical Center and made an appointment under his real name, which felt like the strangest thing he'd done in years. The first session with Dr. Han Ji-woo lasted 40 minutes, most of which Dojin spent gauging her. She was 53, small-framed, the kind of woman whose stillness read as patience rather than passivity. She had an office that smelled like old books and weak coffee, and she didn't use a couch, just 2 chairs angled toward each other, no desk between them, which Dojin noted immediately as a deliberate choice about power dynamics. She had a small notepad on her knee that she wrote in occasionally without looking down, which was a skill he recognized and respected. She let him talk for the first 10 minutes without directing him. Most people, Dojin had learned over decades, would rather fill silence than sit inside it. He was not most people, so he spoke deliberately and watched her face for what the words produced. Almost nothing. She was good. "You're testing me," she said, after a pause that had stretched to nearly a minute. "I evaluate people I work with," he said. "It's habit." "You're not working with me, you're in therapy." "Is there a difference?" She wrote something down. "What do you want from these sessions?" "My attorneys suggested I need documented evidence of participation." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "What do you want?" she said again, slower, "from these sessions? Not what you want them to produce on paper. What do you want?" He had not been asked a question like that in a very long time. People asked him what he needed, what he decided, what he intended, not what he wanted in the simple human sense, as if wanting was something he still had access to outside of strategy. "I want to understand why I keep losing the thing I'm trying to protect," he said. It surprised him that he'd said it, the honesty of it. "Doctor." Ken wrote something and looked up. "Okay," she said. "Let's start there." Malcolm Brooks called on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Nia had left. Dojin was in the car when the call came through. Unlisted number, but the exchange was American military adjacent, the kind of number that doesn't show up in Korean directories. He picked up before the second ring because he'd been expecting it and dreading it in equal measure. "You accepted the conditions fast," Malcolm said. "No greeting. They were reasonable conditions." "I know they were. I helped write them." A pause. Rain on the car windows again. Dojin had started to hate the rain. "How is she?" he asked. "Better than she was." Malcolm's voice was flat. Not hostile yet, but carrying the particular energy of a man who had made a decision about how much patience he was going to extend, and was making sure you understood the quantity was limited. "She's sleeping. Baby's good. OB says everything's on track for the due date." "Good." "I'm not calling to give you updates, Kong. I'm calling because Nia asked me not to call you, and I'm calling anyway, which should tell you something about why I'm calling." Dojin waited. "There are people watching your building," Malcolm said. "Not yours, not law enforcement, far as I can tell. Someone external, running surveillance on the syndicate. I picked it up 3 days ago and cross-referenced twice before I called you." Dojin sat up. The bodyguard in the front seat felt the shift and straightened without being told. "Which building?" Dojin said. "Your main office tower. Eastern face, 2 vehicles, rotating 6-hour shifts. One of them has a long lens that's not pointed at your windows. It's pointed at the parking structure entrance. They're logging who comes and goes." "You're sure?" "I spent 11 years doing reconnaissance in environments where being wrong got people killed," Malcolm said. "I'm sure." Dojin processed this. The timing. Byung-soo's comments about Jeon. The missed provocation in the meeting. The sense he'd had, operating below articulation for 2 weeks, that the territory pressure wasn't random friction, but something with direction. "Why are you telling me this?" Dojin said. The silence on Malcolm's end had a texture to it, careful, like a man deciding how honest to be. "Because Nia's name is still Kong," Malcolm said. "Because my nephew or niece is coming in 4 weeks. And because whatever war you're about to have with whoever is running that surveillance, I need it to not touch my sister's address." A pause. "That's the only reason. Are we clear?" "Perfectly clear." "Good." Another pause. "You're going to therapy." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Is it doing anything?" Dojin considered the question seriously. "I think so. It's hard to tell from the inside." Malcolm made a sound that might have been the beginning of something, and then wasn't. "She's not coming back because you're going to therapy, Kang. You understand that?" "Yes." "People do grand gestures when they're scared. Therapy, big apologies, the whole production. It doesn't move her. What moves her is whether it's real and whether it lasts." "I know." "I'm not sure you do, but—" Malcolm exhaled. "Handle your surveillance problem before it handles you, and don't make me regret this call." He hung up. Dojin turned to his bodyguard in the front seat. "Get me Byung-soo." Byung-soo arrived at the office within 30 minutes, which meant he'd been close, which meant he'd been waiting for something like this. Dojin laid it out quickly. The external surveillance, Malcolm's description, the timing against the recent Jeon provocations. He watched Byung-soo's face do the thing it did when the old man was 2 steps ahead. A slight tightening around the eyes. Not surprise, but confirmation. "You already knew," Dojin said. "I suspected," Byung-soo said carefully. "How long?" 5 days. Byung-soo met his eyes without flinching, which was the right move. Dojin didn't punish honesty. "I didn't want to bring it to you until I had more than suspicion. You've been—" A careful pause. "Occupied." 5 days, Dojin repeated. The number sat badly. In 5 days, surveillance that disciplined could have mapped the movement patterns of every lieutenant he had. "Who do you think is running it?" "Not John directly. This is too clean for Jeon's people." Byung-soo sat down, which he did rarely, and only when a conversation was going to take time. "There's a group, been operating out of Incheon for about 8 months, building logistics infrastructure that overlaps with our port operations. We had them flagged as potential competition, but nothing definitive. Name. They operate under a shell, Cheongsu Logistics, but the money comes from somewhere older." Byung-soo looked at his hands. "Cho Dae-sung's people." The name did what names like that do in rooms like this. It changed the quality of the air. Cho Dae-sung had been removed from the Baeko Syndicate's inner circle 11 years ago. Removed was the polite word. Dojin had been 29, newly consolidated as boss, and Cho had been the man who trained him, the older figure who had shepherded a hungry, violent, too smart 22-year-old through the brutal architecture of syndicate politics. Dojin had trusted him more than he'd trusted anyone before or since. And then he'd found the accounts. The quiet redirections. Money that was supposed to fund the organization's operating costs, channeled instead through 3 layers of shell companies into Cho's private holdings. Not a catastrophic amount, just enough, over 2 years, to constitute a pattern. A test of what he could take without being seen. Dojin had been seen. The conversation had been brief. Cho had not begged, which Dojin had respected. He'd simply looked at the evidence, then at Dojin, with the measuring expression of a man recalibrating. "You were supposed to be too loyal to look," Cho had said. "I was supposed to be," Dojin had agreed. "I'm not." He'd given Cho 48 hours to liquidate his holdings and leave. No announcement, no violence. The organization never knew the real reason Cho Dae-sung had retired quietly to somewhere outside of Seoul. Some speculated Busan, some said Japan. Dojin had never confirmed or denied. That had been 11 years ago. "How certain are you?" Dojin said. 70%. Byung-soo paused. 80. If the Incheon Shell Company is what I think it is, I need 2 more days to confirm. "You have one." Byung-soo nodded and stood. "Byung-soo." Dojin looked at the window. "The fact that this is happening now." The timing. I know. They waited for me to be distracted. Yes. Which means they've been watching us long enough to know I would be. Byung-soo was quiet for a moment. It's a reasonable play. If I were Cho Dae-sung, sitting on 11 years of patience, watching for the right moment. He stopped. The boss being distracted by a family crisis is the right moment. Dojin pressed his thumb against the folded edge of the letter he still kept in his pocket. The paper had gone soft from handling. Set up the counter surveillance, he said, quietly. No moves until I say. Understood. And tell no one about Cho, not yet. Yes, boss. The door closed. Dojin sat alone with the intelligence that his old mentor had spent over a decade building something designed to dismantle him, and had timed its activation to the week Nia walked out of his penthouse. He could not decide which part of that hurt worse. The therapy sessions continued twice a week regardless. Dojin structured them as he structured everything, deliberately, showing up exactly on time, using the 50 minutes efficiently. Dr. Han noticed the efficiency and started pushing against it around the third session, inserting silences where he expected her to follow his thread, redirecting when he turned personal history into a strategic analysis. You're explaining your childhood to me like it was a business problem you solved, she said during the fourth session. Wasn't it? Was it? He'd grown up in Dobonggu, in an apartment building that had more people in it than seemed structurally advisable, raised by a grandmother who'd done what she could and run out of what she had when he was 15. He told Dr. Han this in the first session, flatly, the way he'd have told a lieutenant relevant operational history, where he came from, what resources were available, what he'd done with limited resources. The boy in that apartment, Dr. Han said. What did he want? Food, money, safety. What else? He looked at the ceiling. To matter to someone, he said. To not be... He stopped. Finish it. To not be the kind of person people leave, he said. The room was quiet. And then, she said. And then I became the kind of person they're afraid to leave, he said. It came out without anger, just recognition. Dr. Han wrote something. Your wife left anyway. Yes. How does that feel? He was quiet for a long time. Like I built the wrong thing, he said finally. Built the wrong thing to prevent the right thing from happening. Yes. Kang Dojin, Doctor, Han said with the kind of steadiness that precedes something landing hard. The boy who didn't want to be left built an empire so powerful that no one could leave without paying a price. Then he married a woman strong enough to leave anyway. Do you think that was an accident? He stared at her. She was always going to test what you built, Dr. Han said, because part of you knew the empire wasn't enough. Part of you chose someone who would tell you the truth. He left that session and sat in his car for 20 minutes without starting it. On the 31st day since Nia had left, Yoon Seo-rin sent a personal message. Not through legal channels. Directly to his phone, which meant she had resources he hadn't fully accounted for. The message was brief. She wanted a follow-up meeting. The casino deal was still open. She understood he'd been dealing with personal matters, and she was patient, but the window wouldn't stay open indefinitely. She added, at the end, I heard about your wife. I want you to know I'm sorry the photo caused a problem. That wasn't my intention. Dojin read the message twice. He forwarded it to Sung-min with a single instruction, find out who Seo-rin's backers were. All of them. Not the investors she'd listed in the negotiation portfolio. The ones behind those. Sung-min came back in 4 hours. 2 of Seo-rin's primary investors shared a holding structure with a Busan-based financial entity that had been incorporated 8 years ago. The same year Cho Dae-sung had been recorded entering Busan for the first time. Dojin set his phone down on his desk. The rooftop meeting. The photo challenge. The deliberate provocation designed to activate his pride, because whoever had briefed Seo-rin had understood Dojin's weak points with the intimacy of someone who'd spent years studying them. The exact pressure point, almost like you have something to hide, that would make a man who'd never made a mistake want to prove he was comfortable. The photo hadn't been an accident, not his sending it. That was genuinely his mistake, his thumb, his inattention. But the photo existing, the situation being engineered so that it would exist, The woman in the right position at the right moment to create something that looked like exactly what it wasn't, that was constructed. Cho Dae-sung had not waited for an opportunity. He had built one. Dojin stood up from his desk and walked to the window. Below him, Seoul moved in its relentless way, traffic and light, and the vast and different machinery of a city that didn't know or care what happened in the offices above it. He had spent 31 days believing he was simply a man who had made a mistake and was living with it. He had been in therapy twice a week working through the idea that the mistake was his alone. His pride, his negligence, his failure to be present. All of that was still true. And underneath it, a man 11 years in the waiting had used that truth like a blade. His daughter was going to be born in 3 weeks. His wife was 40 minutes away in a protected address he'd agreed not to approach. His organization was being mapped by surveillance that had started before the photo and would continue until he addressed it with the kind of clarity that his distraction had made temporarily impossible. He pressed his knuckles against the glass and looked at the river. For the first time in 31 days, the grief and the anger existed in the same moment without one swallowing the other. He could feel both completely. The loss of Nia's dry eyes in that kitchen, the cold mechanical rage at what had been done to him, to her, to the life they were supposed to be building, and remained standing inside all of it. He picked up his phone and called Byung-soo. "I need a meeting," he said. "Full council, tomorrow morning, and I need everything you have on Cho." "All of it?" "All of it. And Byung-soo." He paused. "I should have asked for it a week ago. I'm asking now." A beat of silence, and then the old man said simply, "Yes, boss." And for the first time in 31 days, the word meant what it used to mean. But across the city, in a building Dojin had once known as well as his own reflection, an old man sat over a glass of cold tea and read a message on his own phone. A 2-word status update from someone inside Dojin's building who shouldn't have been there at all, confirming the council meeting, confirming the name they'd used. The old man read it twice, set down his tea, and allowed himself the first real smile he'd permitted in 11 years, because he had planned for exactly this moment, the moment the tiger finally noticed the cage had been built around him. What he had not planned for was what kind of tiger, after 31 days of grief and therapy and the slow, terrifying work of becoming something other than what he'd always been, Kang Dojin had decided to be. The council meeting started at 7 in the morning. Dojin arrived first, which he always did, because arriving first meant watching everyone else enter and reading what their bodies said before their mouths opened. He stood at the head of the long conference table with a coffee he wasn't drinking and watched his 7 most senior people file in over the next 12 minutes. Operations, finance, logistics, legal, Territory East, Territory West, and Byung-soo, who came last and sat closest, the way he always did when things were serious. Nobody spoke until Dojin sat down. He laid out what he knew in the order he'd learned it. The external surveillance, Malcolm's tip, Byung-soo's intelligence on Cheongsu logistics, the financial thread connecting Seo Rin's backers to a Busan holding entity, the Busan entity to Cho Dae-sung. He presented it without drama. Flat chronology. Let the facts carry their own weight. The room was silent for a moment after he finished. Then Jang Woo-chul, who ran Eastern Territory and had been with the syndicate since before Dojin took leadership, said, "Cho Dae-sung." "Yes." "He's been gone 11 years. "He's been building for 11 years, Dojin said. "There's a difference." Woo-chul absorbed this. He was 57, built like someone who'd spent his 30s in situations that required physical durability, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had survived enough to know that his first reaction to information was rarely his most useful one. He looked at Byung-soo. "You verified this." "Enough to bring it here," Byung-soo said. "What's the exposure?" This from Lee Hyun-soo, finance, who processed threat information in terms of asset vulnerability before anything else. It was what made him valuable and occasionally exhausting. "We don't know the full picture yet," Dojin said. "The surveillance on the parking structure means they've been mapping movement patterns. How long that's been running, what they've confirmed, where else they may have access. We're still establishing that." "Where else they may have access?" Hyun-soo said it slowly. "Boss, if Cho has been operational for 8 months under Cheong-soo, I know." 8 months is long enough to— "I know," Dojin said, not harshly, just with the finality that ended that particular thread. Hyun-soo closed his mouth. Dojin looked around the table. All 7 of them. Men he had selected, tested, and in most cases trusted with enough operational knowledge to dismantle the organization if they chose to. That was the nature of inner councils. They were always built from the people with the most capacity to betray you, because those were also the people with the most capacity to protect you. I want a compartmentalized review, he said. Each of you reviews your own area. Financial records, communication logs, personnel access, going back 14 months. Not your teams, you, personally. Anything that looks irregular, anything that looks like contact from outside that wasn't reported, anything that looks like access that shouldn't exist, you bring it to me or Byung-soo within 48 hours. No one talks to anyone else about what they find before that. A pause. Meaning, Woo-chul said carefully, you think there's someone in this room. I think Cho Dae-sung has had 8 months and the resources to be patient, Dojin said. I think he knew my personal situation with enough specificity to time the Seorin approach. I think that level of operational intelligence doesn't come from external surveillance alone. He met each face around the table for exactly long enough to communicate that he was not guessing. I think 48 hours is enough time for someone with a clean conscience to complete a review. He stood up. That's all. They filed out. Dojin watched them go and counted the variations in how they left. Who spoke quietly to whom in the doorway, who left alone, who glanced back. These were the readings you took when you couldn't afford to be wrong. Byung-soo was last. He stopped at the door. The Seorin meeting, Byung-soo said. She requested a follow-up. I know, I got her message. What do you want to do with her? Dojin picked up his coffee, cold by now. He drank it anyway. Leave her alone for now. If she's Cho's instrument, pulling her will tell him we've connected the thread. I'd rather he doesn't know what we know yet. Byung-soo nodded slowly. And if she's not entirely Cho's instrument, if she made her own calculation about which side to be useful to, then she's smarter and more dangerous than she presented, Dojin said, which makes leaving her alone even more important until we understand her fully. Byung-soo left. Dojin stood at the window for a while, looking at the parking structure entrance where, somewhere beneath the sightlines of his building, 2 vehicles he hadn't detected for 5 days had logged the movements of everyone he trusted. He thought about Cho Dae-sung's face the day they'd last spoken. The recalibrating look. You were supposed to be too loyal to look. 11 years. Whatever the man had become in 11 years of patient, deliberate construction, he had remained, underneath it, the person who had looked at a 29-year-old and decided the appropriate response to being caught was to wait. Dojin had always known that patience was the most dangerous quality a person could have. He had never expected to have it used against him by someone he'd taught it to. The 48 hours passed. 6 of the 7 council members returned clean reviews, records that showed nothing irregular, the kind of operational tidiness that came from either genuine integrity or very careful preparation. Dojin went through each one with Byung-soo, cross-referencing against independent records where they existed, looking for the seam between what was reported and what was. The 7th didn't come back at all. Park Sung-min knocked on Dojin's office door at the end of the 2nd day with the careful expression he used when delivering information that was going to require Dojin to remain still. Jang Woo-chul, Sung-min said. Dojin set down his pen. He submitted a review. I cross-referenced it against the Eastern Territory communication logs you asked me to pull independently. Sung-min laid a folder on the desk. There are 14 communications in the past 6 months that don't appear in what he submitted. 11 are to a number registered to a shell company in Incheon. A pause. Cheongsu Logistics. Dojin looked at the folder without opening it. Woo-chul, he said. Yes. Jang Woo-chul, 57 years old, Eastern Territory for 9 years. Present at the table the morning Dojin had laid out everything he knew about Cho's operation, every piece of intelligence, every thread he'd connected, every gap he was still filling. Present, while Dojin had explained exactly where the investigation stood present 12 hours ago. Where is he now? Dojin said. His apartment. Security detail confirmed 30 minutes ago. He hasn't moved. No. Dojin opened the folder. The communication logs were printed cleanly, timestamps aligned, the Incheon number appearing and reappearing across 6 months with a regularity that wasn't coincidence. The last contact was 4 days ago, 2 days before the council meeting. He thought about the meeting, who Wu Chul had looked at when Cho's name was said. The way he'd asked, he's been gone 11 years with the particular intonation of someone performing surprise. He called after the meeting, Dojin said. It wasn't a question. Sungmin's pause was the answer. 4 hours after, Sungmin said. 12-minute call. Dojin closed the folder. He had run the Baiko syndicate for 20 years without losing a council member to an external actor. The organization had its internal fractures, ambition, grievance, the ordinary erosion of loyalty under pressure. But the inner council had been the one structure he'd kept clean through a combination of selection, compensation, and the understood cost of betrayal. Wu Chul had been at the table when that cost was last demonstrated. He had been there and understood it and waited 11 years and done it anyway. Bring him in, Dojin said. Quiet, his own car, no escort. Tell him I need to discuss the Eastern Territory review. Make it routine. Sungmin nodded. And Sungmin? Dojin looked up. How long have you known? Sungmin was still for exactly 1 second. I had a suspicion 4 days ago. I needed to confirm it before I brought it to you. 4 days. Yes. Next time, Dojin said carefully, the suspicion comes to me the same day. Yes, boss. Wu Chul arrived at the office building at 9 in the evening, which was ordinary. Late meetings were ordinary, the kind of operational reality that Wu Chul had navigated for 9 years without incident. He came through the parking structure, took the elevator to the 14th floor, where Dojin kept the secondary conference room used for sensitive conversations, and walked in to find Dojin sitting alone at one end of the table with the communication folder open in front of him and no bodyguards visible. The absence of bodyguards was its own message. Wu Chul read it in the first second, and his face did something complicated before it settled into the stillness of a man who had decided, somewhere between the elevator and the door, how he was going to handle this. He sat down. He looked at the folder. How long? Dojin said. Wu Chul looked at the window. A long moment. Then, 3 years. Dojin had expected 6 months, because that's what the records showed. 3 years meant the records had been managed, that Wu Chul had been careful enough to clean most of the trail, and only the last 6 months had slipped through, or had been left deliberately, or both. 3 years, Dojin said, before the Changsu setup, before any of the infrastructure. He reached out through a third party. Wu Chul's voice was flat, not apologetic, not defiant. The voice of a man delivering a report. He wanted current operational structure, leadership hierarchy, territory boundaries. I told him I needed time to consider. And you considered for 3 years. I told him no twice. Wu Chul finally looked at him. The third time, he had something I couldn't walk away from. What? A pause. And here Wu Chul's composure cracked, just slightly, not dramatically, not the way it happened in films where men wept and confessed. Just a small tightening around the eyes that Dojin recognized as the edge of something real. My son, Wu Chul said. He's 23. He runs a small business in Incheon. Legitimate, nothing to do with this. Cho's people approached him. Not a threat, just a conversation. Just enough to make clear that the conversation could become something else if I continued to say no. Dojin looked at him for a long time. You didn't come to me, Dojin said. No. 3 years ago, when he first made contact, you didn't come to me. No. Wu Chul met his eyes. Because I wasn't sure at that point whether coming to you was safe. The room was very quiet. Explain that, Dojin said. Cho told me. Wu Chul stopped, breathed. He told me that he hadn't left 11 years ago, that he'd been asked to leave because he'd discovered something about you that you couldn't afford to have known, that the embezzlement story was fabricated, that you'd planted it. Dojin felt the specific cold of a well-constructed lie landing exactly where it was designed to land. He told you I fabricated the evidence against him. He was convincing, Wu Chul said quietly. He had documentation. I don't know if it was real. I looked at it and I couldn't tell. And I thought... He stopped again. I thought if he was right, if you'd done that to him, then I needed to understand what I was actually part of before I walked into your office with any of it. Dojin stood up. He didn't do it out of anger. He did it because the room was suddenly too small, and he needed the half-second that standing provided. The fabricated documentation. Of course there was fabricated documentation. Cho Dae-sung had had 11 years and presumably significant resources and a specific, intimate understanding of how Doojin operated, what records he kept, how evidence was structured within the organization, what a planted file would need to contain to be convincing to someone who knew the system. He had seeded doubt. 3 years ago, he had planted a story in Wu Chul's mind that made coming to Dojin feel like the dangerous option. And then he had left it there and let it grow, while Wu Chul made 3 years of increasingly difficult decisions, each one compounding the last, until the decision tree had narrowed to the point where cooperation felt like the only remaining path. It was exactly what Dojin would have done. That was the part that sat worst. "The documentation," Dojin said. "Do you still have it?" "Yes." "I want it." Wu Chul reached into his jacket, which was either trusting or calculated. Dojin filed both possibilities and withdrew a folded envelope. He set it on the table between them. Dojin picked it up without opening it. "I'm going to ask you one question," Dojin said, "and I want you to understand that the answer determines everything that happens next, including what happens to your son's business, not as a threat, as a fact." Wu Chul nodded. "In the past 6 months of active contact, the 14 communications in the Changsu logs, what specifically did you give them?" Wu Chul's jaw worked. "Logistics schedules for the port operations, the name of our legal counsel's firm, the locations of 2 secondary storage facilities." A pause. "And your home address?" "The townhouse in Seongbuk-dong." The townhouse, the modest townhouse in the quiet neighborhood, where Dojin had moved after leaving the penthouse, where he'd gone specifically because it wasn't connected to the syndicate's operational infrastructure, where he'd felt, irrationally, slightly less like himself and slightly more like the person he was trying to find out if he could become. Cho had his home address, not the penthouse, the townhouse, the one that was supposed to be private. Dojin set the envelope on the table and looked at Wu Chul with the particular stillness that, among people who knew him well, communicated more than any raised voice could. "Did you give him anything else?" he said. Wu Chul hesitated. That hesitation lasted exactly 2 seconds. In Dojin's experience, a man with nothing more to disclose didn't hesitate. A man calculating what he could still protect hesitated. "What else?" Dojin said. "The therapy clinic," Wu Chul said quietly. "The location. The name of your psychiatrist." The air in the room changed quality. Dr. Han Ji-woo, Yonsei University Medical Center. The 53-year-old woman in the office that smelled like old books, who had looked at him across 2 chairs with no desk between them and asked what he wanted and waited for him to tell the truth. Cho had her location. Dojin turned away from Wu Chul and walked to the window. The city below was doing its ordinary nighttime thing. Lights, traffic, the Han River catching the glow of the bridges. He pressed his hand flat against the glass and breathed. The therapy clinic information changed the calculation in a specific and very bad way. Cho didn't just want to dismantle the syndicate's operations. That was the business goal. Territories, logistics, the financial infrastructure that the Changsu setup was designed to absorb. But a man who had waited 11 years for revenge against a specific person wasn't satisfied with a business outcome. He wanted Dojin specifically. And the therapy clinic, the psychiatrist's name, that was personal intelligence. The kind you gathered when you were building leverage over a person, not just dismantling their organization. The boss goes to therapy. The boss is vulnerable. Here is where you find him when his guard is lowest. Or worse, here is something I can use to reach him that isn't his organization. Dojin pulled out his phone and called Sung Min. "The Yonsei Clinic," he said when Sung Min picked up. "Dr. Han's office. I need security on the building within the hour. Plain clothes, nothing that reads as syndicate, and I need her notified. She gets a personal call from me, not from staff." "Done. Anything else?" "Cross-check the townhouse. I want to know if there's been any activity on the street in the past 2 weeks that doesn't belong." A pause. "Boss, do you want to consider moving to a secured location?" "No," Dojin said. "If I move, it tells them we've connected it. I stay in the townhouse. We maintain the appearance that nothing's changed, and we use the next 72 hours to... He stopped. His phone was buzzing. A second call, coming in simultaneously. He looked at the screen. Malcolm Brooks. He answered. I know it's late, Malcolm said immediately, and the quality of his voice told Dojin in the first syllable that this was not a routine call. I need you to listen before you say anything. Go, Dojin said. Someone ran a location check on Nia's address tonight. Not my people. External. I picked it up because I have a wire on the building's internet router. It's how I run the perimeter. A pause, controlled. The pause of a trained man making sure his information is exact before he delivers it. The query came from an IP block registered to a logistics company in Incheon. The floor did not actually move. It felt like it did. Chung-Soo, Dojin said. I don't know that name, but whoever ran it, they know the building. They don't have the unit number, not from this query, but they have the block and the street. Dojin was already moving, back to the table. Woochul looked up at him, and whatever was in Dojin's face made Woochul press back slightly in his chair. Did you give him Nia's location? Dojin said. Woochul's face went the color of old paper. I didn't know it. I don't have her address. You pulled the security detail. There was no... Did you give him anything that could be used to find her? Her brother's name, the legal firm, anything. The legal firm, Woochul said. I gave him the name of the legal firm. Attorney Choi Yeon-hee's office, who had received Dojin's written acceptance of conditions, who had presumably received correspondence from Nia's side as well. And correspondence had return addresses or traceable filing details or 100 other small digital and paper threads that a patient and well-resourced man could pull until one of them led somewhere. They hadn't needed her address. They'd needed a starting thread. Dojin spoke to Malcolm. You need to move her, right now. Different building, somewhere you control. Don't tell anyone the location, including your own staff, until she's inside. He was walking toward the door. Can you do that in the next 20 minutes? I can do it in 10, Malcolm said. Do it. Call me when she's secure. He hung up and looked at Woochul. Woochul was standing now because he had heard enough of the conversation to understand what the legal firm information had set in motion, and the color hadn't come back to his face. I didn't know about her, Woochul said. I didn't know he would go for her. I thought this was about the organization. Cho Dae-sung doesn't separate the organization from me, Dojin said. He never has. The organization is the point of leverage, not the point. He picked up the communication folder. Everything Cho wanted from you, everything he's built over 3 years, it was always about making me choose between the Empire and something I'd lose the Empire to protect. He said it without looking at Woochul. He knew about Nia, Dojin said. He knew about the pregnancy. He factored in the photo because someone told him what pressure points to give Seorin. He waited until I was at my most distracted, most vulnerable, most... He stopped, pressed his hand flat against the door frame, breathed once. He has been in my life for 3 years through you, and I didn't see it. The hallway was empty. His bodyguards were at the elevator, visible, heads turning as he came through the door. He kept walking. Behind him, he heard Woochul. Dojin. He stopped, didn't turn. I was afraid, Woochul said. Not for myself. For my son. I made the wrong choice because I was afraid for my son. Dojin understood that. He understood it in a way he wouldn't have 3 months ago, before a pregnancy and a photograph and a letter with 7 words on it, and a 53-year-old psychiatrist who asked him what he actually wanted. He understood what a father's fear could make a person do. He turned around. Your son's business, he said. Is it clean? Yes. It stays clean. You don't tell him any of this, ever. He held Woochul's gaze. You're done with the council. You resign for health reasons, effective tomorrow. You don't leave Seoul, you don't contact anyone from this organization, and you don't contact Cho or anyone connected to him. If you do any of those things, the protection I'm extending to your son's business ends. Woochul was quiet, then, You're not... I need you cooperative, and I need you silent, and I need your son safe, Dojin said. That's what's useful to me right now. What happens to you after this is handled is a conversation for later. He paused. I'd focus on making sure there is a later. He walked to the elevator. Malcolm called back in 18 minutes. Nia was in a new location, a secured apartment Malcolm maintained under a different name for exactly this category of emergency, the kind of contingency planning that Dojin had always privately respected about him. She was unhurt, irritated, 8 months and 1 week pregnant, and had asked Malcolm 3 times why they were moving and received 3 non-answers. She's going to want to know what's happening, Malcolm said. Tell her there's a security concern related to the syndicate. It's not a direct threat to her. We're being cautious. Dojin was in his car, heading for the Beko's secondary operations building. Not the main tower, which was compromised, but a property held under a corporate name that hadn't appeared in anything he'd given the council in the past 3 years. Tell her I'm handling it. A pause. She's going to ask if it has anything to do with you. It has to do with someone who wants to use her to get to me, Dojin said. That's the truth. Tell her that much. Another pause. Longer. She's going to want to talk to you. Dojin pressed his thumb against the phone. Tell her I'll call when she's settled and I have more information. Tell her... He stopped. His voice was doing something he didn't entirely have control over. Tell her the baby is the priority, that everything I'm doing right now is about making sure the baby is safe. Malcolm's silence lasted 2 seconds. I'll tell her. The call ended. Dojin looked out the car window at the city. They were crossing the Han River, the bridge lights reflecting broken on the water below, and he thought about Cho Dae-sung sitting somewhere patient and deliberate, reading the intelligence that told him everything was proceeding according to plan. The organization disrupted. The boss isolated and emotionally compromised. The pregnant wife located through the thread of a law firm's correspondence. Cho thought he was 3 moves ahead. He was not 3 moves ahead. He had made a mistake that he didn't know he'd made yet, and the mistake was this. He had planned against the Kong Dojin who had existed a month ago. The man who kept everything at arm's length, who controlled through distance, who built walls instead of connections. The man for whom the empire was the thing worth protecting. 31 days of therapy, and a letter with 7 words, and the specific education of learning what it felt like to have someone choose to leave when they could have chosen to stay. These things had not made Dojin weaker. They had made him different, and Cho had built his entire strategy against a man who no longer existed. Dojin called Su and said 3 words. Find Cho Dae-sung. Not locate him, with the careful operational language that meant surveillance and intelligence gathering. Find him. The distinction communicated exactly what it was intended to communicate, and Byung-soo heard it without needing it explained. Yes, boss, Byung-soo said, and this time when the call ended, Dojin felt the particular cold clarity that had carried him through 20 years of correct decisions. Except this time, it wasn't running on hunger or ruthlessness or the desperate need of a boy who had decided that power was the only safe thing. It was running on something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous. He had a daughter coming into the world in 3 weeks, and the man who had tried to use that daughter as leverage had just made it personal in the only way that mattered. Byung-soo found Cho Dae-sung in 4 hours. Not in Busan. Not in Japan. 40 minutes outside of Seoul, in a property registered to a construction holding company that traced back 3 shell layers before dissolving into a Cayman Islands trust that had never been publicly connected to anything, the kind of financial architecture that took years to build and significant capital to maintain, and that communicated, more than anything else, how long Cho had been preparing for exactly this moment. The property was a converted farmhouse on 2 acres in Yangpyeong County, surrounded by the kind of quiet that made surveillance easy and approach difficult. Byung-soo's man had found it through a combination of the Incheon IP block Malcolm had identified and a financial thread in the Cheongsu logistics records that connected to a utility account, electricity, running since 14 months ago, consistent with the kind of consumption that supported a small residential operation. Not a headquarters, a retreat. The place a careful man went when he needed to think without being interrupted. Dojin looked at the property photographs spread across the table in the secondary operations building and felt the particular clarity of a problem becoming concrete. How many people? He said. 4 confirmed. Possibly 6. Byung-soo's finger moved across the photographs. 2 on exterior rotation, 1 at the main entrance, 1 that our man clocked moving between the farmhouse and the secondary structure. A converted barn, probably operational. A pause. Not a large security presence. He wasn't expecting to need one. He thought he was invisible. He thought he was invisible. Visible, Byung-soo confirmed. Dojin straightened. Around the table were 5 men. Not the full council, which was compromised and restructuring, but the people Byung-soo had vetted personally over the past 48 hours while Dojin handled the Wuchul situation and the Nia relocation. Smaller, faster, less vulnerable. Seorin, Dojin said. Where is she? Her building in Gangnam. She hasn't left since this morning. She knows something's moving. Probably. She's chose access point into the legitimate business layer. If the Chungsu structure starts coming apart, she'll know it before most people. Dojin looked at Sung-min. I want someone on her building, not to move on her, just to log if she tries to contact anyone or leave. Sung-min nodded. And the port logistics schedule, Dojin said. The one Wuchul gave them. How much operational damage could they do with it? Hyun-soo, who had come to this meeting because his financial forensics were non-negotiable, looked up from the papers in front of him. 2 shipments in the next 72 hours that used the schedule he handed over. If Cho's people wanted to intercept or interfere, those are the windows. Can we reroute? One of them, yes. The other is too far into the logistics chain. Changing the route now would require notifying partners who aren't inside this room, and we can't control what those notifications reach. Dojin looked at the property photographs again. Yangpyeong County, 40 minutes. Then we have 72 hours before they use what Wuchul gave them, he said, and we need this resolved before that window opens. Nobody argued with the math. Tonight, Dojin said. Byung-soo met his eyes. Boss, you're not going personally. I'm going personally. The operational risk. Cho Dae-sung spent 11 years building something designed to take everything from me, Dojin said. I'm not sending people in my place to finish it. I'm going. Byung-soo looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who had made his professional objection and understood it had landed and was now calculating how to make the thing his boss was going to do anyway as survivable as possible. Then we plan it properly, Byung-soo said. We take 6 hours and we do this right. We take 4, Dojin said, and we do it right in 4. They left at 2 in the morning. 3 vehicles, staggered intervals, dark and unmarked. The kind of operational anonymity that Dojin's people had practiced long enough that it was muscle memory. Dojin rode in the middle vehicle with Sung-min and 2 men who had been with the organization since before Dojin had finished consolidating leadership and who had the particular competence of people who'd seen enough to be genuinely calm in situations that should require otherwise. The city dropped away behind them as they moved east. The Han River, the bridges, the glittering urban density of Seoul giving way to the outer districts, and then the quieter dark of the countryside. The roads narrowing, the light sources becoming occasional and warm instead of relentless. Dojin sat in the back seat and didn't talk. Sung-min sat beside him and understood that silence wasn't absence. It was Dojin processing, running the variables, accounting for what he knew and cataloging what he didn't. Sung-min had worked for him long enough to know the difference between the boss being somewhere else and the boss being completely, dangerously present in a way that happened to look quiet. Dojin was completely present. He thought about Cho. Not strategically. He'd done that. The planning was done. He thought about the man. The 60-something person who had looked at a 29-year-old and decided to wait rather than fight, who had spent 11 years in the patient architecture of revenge, who had been smart enough and disciplined enough to build something real and use it with precision. There was a version of Dojin that could look at that and find something close to respect. There was a version that found it clarifying. Cho had built his entire campaign on the assumption that Dojin's weakness was the empire, that threatening the organization would paralyze him. He had identified the wife, the pregnancy, the emotional exposure of the past month, and used those not as the primary lever but as softening mechanisms. Ways to ensure Dojin was off balance when the real operational pressure arrived. What he hadn't planned for was the possibility that Dojin might stop caring about the empire. Not permanently, not completely, but enough. In the specific window of the past 35 days, during the therapy sessions and the empty penthouse and the letter folded in his jacket pocket, enough that the threat to the organization landed differently than it would have 6 months ago. 6 months ago, threatening the Bayako Syndicate would have triggered every defensive response Dojin had, all the way down. It would have consumed him. Instead, it had clarified him. His phone buzzed. Malcolm. He answered without taking his eyes off the road ahead. She's awake, Malcolm said. It was past 2 in the morning. Is she okay? She's Nia. She doesn't sleep well when she doesn't have information. A pause. She knows something serious is happening. She's not panicking. She's never been a panicker. But she's sitting in the kitchen of this apartment at 2 in the morning, drinking decaf and looking at her phone. Tell her I'll call her tomorrow morning. Tell her... He stopped. Tell her I know she's waiting, and I'm not going to make her wait longer than I have to. I'll tell her. Malcolm's voice shifted slightly, the way it did when he was deciding something. Kang, whatever you're doing tonight, be careful. It was the closest thing to goodwill Malcolm had ever directed at him. Dojin registered it without making anything of it. I will be. He ended the call. Sungmin looked at him briefly and then back at the road. You're thinking about her, Sungmin said. I'm thinking about everything, Dojin said. That's the job. They cut the engines 300 meters from the property line and moved the rest of the way on foot. The night was cold and clear, the kind of rural dark that people who grew up in cities don't expect. Not just the absence of light, but a quality of quiet that registered physically, made every footstep on gravel feel conspicuous. Dojin had spent his 20s in situations that required physical precision in the dark. The body remembered what the years had softened, came back to it with less complaint than he'd expected. Byung-Soo's advance man had marked the exterior rotation pattern, 2 men, 90-second intervals between position changes, a gap on the south side of the property that lasted 45 seconds. They went through the south side. The farmhouse lights were on. Not all of them. One window on the ground floor, amber and steady, the light of a room where someone was awake and working. The secondary barn structure was dark. The man at the main entrance was stationed under an overhang, facing out, not moving with the rotational pattern the others used, which meant he was the anchor, the one who stayed fixed while the others moved. Sungmin's hand came up. Dojin stopped. The anchor guard had turned his head, not toward them, toward the farmhouse. Something had drawn his attention, a sound from inside, or a communication, or just the ordinary restlessness of a man at 2 in the morning who had been standing in one place for too long. They waited. The guard turned back. They moved. The entrance was handled cleanly and quickly, and with the minimum necessary force. Dojin had given that instruction explicitly because dead men couldn't answer questions, and he had questions. The anchor guard went down without a sound that carried. Sungmin zip-tied the man's wrists with the efficiency of someone who had done this enough that thinking wasn't required. The ground floor window. Dojin positioned himself to one side of the farmhouse's main door and looked in through the glass. Cho Dae-sung sat at a wooden table with a laptop open in front of him, a glass of water at his elbow, reading something on the screen with the focused calm of a man who believed himself completely secure. I was older than the last photograph Dojin had seen. There had been one, surveillance from 2 years ago when they'd flagged Chung-soo as a potential competitor, before anyone had connected the thread to a face. Cho's hair was fully white now, and he wore it longer than he had during his years in the organization. It was thinner. He held his shoulders differently than Dojin remembered, not with the coiled readiness of an active operator, but with the settled posture of someone who had moved to a different kind of work. Planning work, patience work. He looked like what he was, a man who had decided that the most dangerous thing he could do was wait. Dojin opened the door. The sound of it brought Cho's head up from the laptop with the speed of a man whose instincts were still intact under the surface calm. He saw Dojin in the doorway, and he did not run, did not reach for anything, did not make a sound. He looked at him for exactly 2 seconds with an expression that moved through surprise and into something that was almost, not quite, but almost, satisfaction. You found me faster than I expected, Cho said. Dojin crossed the room and sat down across from him at the table. Sungmin and one other man came through the door and took positions. Neither spoke. You didn't make it very hard, Dojin said. I made it hard enough to tell me whether you were still the same man. Cho's voice was older, rougher, but the cadence was familiar in a way that sat badly in Dojin's chest. The voice of someone whose patterns of speech you'd absorbed because you'd spent formative years listening to them. You found me in less than a day after you moved. That means you're operational again. He glanced at Sungmin, then back. You moved faster than the distracted version of you would have. The distracted version is done, Dojin said. Is it? Cho tilted his head, the studying look. Dojin had seen that look 1,000 times across 1,000 meetings during the years when Cho had been his mentor, his closest advisor, the man who had taught him that patience was the most dangerous quality a person could have. You've been in therapy. I know the clinic, the doctor's name. Do you know what that tells me about you? It tells you I'm the same man who looked at your accounts and didn't look away, Dojin said. Someone who does the uncomfortable thing when he needs to. Something shifted in Cho's expression. Not softening, recalibration. The same expression from 11 years ago across a different table. You were supposed to be distracted, Cho said. The photograph, the wife leaving, the pregnancy. You were supposed to be running the organization on half a mind while I finished the Chongsu setup. By the time you were operational again, the port logistics would have been disrupted, the Eastern Territory revenue stream compromised, and 3 of your major legitimate business partners would have received documentation suggesting you'd been using their companies to launder. He stopped, looked at Dojin's face. You already know all of it. I know enough, Dojin said. Shit. The documentation went to 2 of the partners already, Cho said. Before tonight, I sent it this evening. I anticipated you might move, so I accelerated the timeline. His voice was completely steady. Whatever you do tonight, the business damage is already in motion. Dojin looked at him. You came here thinking it was salvageable, Cho said. It's not fully salvageable. I've been too careful for it to be fully salvageable. I know, Dojin said. I didn't come here to salvage the business. This was the moment he saw something genuine in Cho's face. Not the performance of calm, but the actual thing underneath it interrupting for just a second. Confusion. Because Cho had built an entire operation on the premise that the business was what Dojin would protect at any cost. Then why? You accessed information about my wife, Dojin said. You sent someone to locate her building. You used a pregnant woman who has nothing to do with the organization as a pressure point. He set his hands flat on the table. That's why. I didn't move on her, Cho said. I located her. I wasn't going to… Tell me you weren't going to use her, Dojin said quietly. Cho's jaw tightened. Tell me, Dojin said, that you located a building where a woman 8 months pregnant is living under protected conditions, and you did that because you weren't going to use it. The silence was the answer. Dojin looked at the man who had taught him everything he'd known at 29 years old, who had been there when he'd consolidated the organization, who had advised the decisions that built the territory, who had sat across from him in rooms not so different from this one, and given counsel that had been genuine, but not all of it. Not in the end, but some of it had been genuine. I was sure of that. And it sat beside everything else in a complicated way that he hadn't expected to feel and wasn't going to pretend he didn't. Cho, he said. Why? Not strategically, not the operational question, the real one. Cho looked at him for a long moment. Something worked in his face. Because you were 22 years old and nothing, he said. And I took that nothing and I shaped it into something, and then you looked at my accounts and treated me like I was replaceable. His voice was still steady, but a thread in it had changed. I built you, and you threw me away. You stole from the organization. I took a percentage of what I'd built, what I'd had a right to. You didn't have the right to take it without permission. You knew the rules. Your rules, Cho said. By the time you made the rules, I had forgotten I hadn't always been working for you. He paused. That's what you do, Kang. You absorb people. You take what they have, and you build it into yourself until they can't find the edges of where they end and you begin. And then one day you look at them with that cold face and you treat them like a liability. The room was quiet. Dojin heard his own breathing, heard Sungmin shift his weight behind him. He had not expected honesty. He'd expected calculation. A man protecting a position, managing information. But underneath the strategy, underneath 11 years of patient construction, there was this. An old man who felt that the person he'd built had discarded him and had decided that the only response to that pain was to become a different and more dangerous kind of patient. Dojin understood it. That was the unexpected part. He understood what it was to build something and feel it used against you. Understood what it did to a person's logic, how it bent the reasonable into the unforgivable through the particular mathematics of hurt. Understanding it didn't change what had to happen. You went after my daughter, Dojin said. Not me, not my organization. My daughter, through her mother. I located, You located a pregnant woman, Dojin said. She's 36 years old. She's 8 months pregnant. She's been living under protective conditions because she was smart enough to know my life makes her a target, and you confirmed that she was right. He kept his voice level. The leveler he was, the worse it was, and he knew Cho knew that. Whatever grievance you have against me, and maybe some of it is legitimate, I'll sit with that. It had nothing to do with her. Cho's eyes moved to the table. Not shame, exactly, but the look of a man who had made a calculation that, at 2 in the morning with the subject sitting across from him, was not holding up the way it had in planning. The documentation I sent to your business partners, Cho said. I'll tell you exactly what it said and how to counter it. I'll give you the full Chongsu logistics structure, every account, every shell, every contact. Enough to dismantle it completely and to give you material to present to the partners as fabricated. He looked up. In exchange for, I know what you're going to ask, Dojin said. Then let me ask it. Walk away, Dojin said. Same offer I made 11 years ago. Except this time, the money isn't on the table. This time, you leave the country. Not Seoul, not Korea. I don't care where. Pick a country that isn't here, that doesn't have connections to my operations, and live out whatever time you have left in it without the organization knowing you're alive. Cho stared at him. You think that's mercy, Cho said. I think it's the same offer you got at 29 that you decided not to accept properly, Dojin said. I'm offering it again, once. A long silence. The farmhouse creaked somewhere above them, the structure settling, or the wind. Dojin didn't look away from Cho's face. The documentation, Cho said finally. I'll give it to you. I know you will, Dojin said. You'll give it to me now. You'll give me the full Chongsu account structure, and you'll tell me every other contact you've activated in the past 3 years that touched my organization. All of it. And then you'll get on a plane. He stood up. You have 20 minutes to compile everything that's on that laptop, he said. After that, Sungmin will accompany you to wherever you need to collect your documents. You'll be out of the country before the business day starts. He walked to the window while Cho worked at the laptop. Outside, the Yangpyeong dark was still and cold. Somewhere distant, something moved through the grass, an animal, or the wind across a field. Dojin looked at his own reflection in the glass and saw a 42-year-old man in a dark jacket with dirt on his shoes standing in a farmhouse at 2:30 in the morning at the end of 11 years of someone else's work. His phone buzzed. Sungmin, from behind him. Boss, we have a problem. He turned. Sungmin was looking at his phone with the expression he used when information arrived that was going to require immediate recalibration. The barn, Sungmin said. Our man outside. There are 2 more people in the barn that weren't in the advance count. One of them just made a call. Dojin processed this in under a second. To who? We're running the number. A pause. Boss, the call was 12 seconds. That's long enough to report a location. Cho had looked up from the laptop. His face was doing something complicated. You have more people, Dojin said. Cho met his eyes and did not answer, which was an answer. Not here, Dojin said slowly. Somewhere else. You have people somewhere else, and your man in the barn just told them something. He crossed back to the table. Where are they? Cho's jaw tightened. This wasn't supposed to happen tonight. You moved too fast. I didn't... Where are they? Dojin said. His voice had dropped to the register that people who'd worked for him learned very quickly was not a prelude to repetition. I had a contingency, Cho said. If you found me before the Chongsu operation was complete, there was a fallback position. A way to ensure... He stopped, swallowed. A way to ensure you'd stand down. The cold in Dojin's chest became something else entirely. You have someone, Dojin said. Not at a business location. Someone personal. Cho didn't answer. The new address, Dojin said. Malcolm moved her tonight. You have someone watching the building she was moved to. I had someone watching all 3 buildings Malcolm controls, Cho said quietly. When she moved, my man followed. He reported the new location 2 hours ago. A pause. The call from the barn just confirmed your current location to a team in Seoul. The math was immediate. Cho's team in Seoul. Nia's location. The 12-second call that had just gone out. Dojin already had his phone to his ear before Cho finished the sentence. Malcolm picked up on the second ring. There's a team moving toward your location right now, Dojin said. How many exits does the building have? A 2-second silence that told him Malcolm was already moving. Then, 3. I have one covered. You need to move her again, right now. Don't use the main exit. Dojin's hand had tightened on the phone until his knuckles had gone white and he hadn't noticed. Malcolm, how long before she can be out of the building? She's... A sound on the line, a door, movement. She's right here. We're moving. How long? 4 minutes if she cooperates. She'll cooperate, Dojin said. He didn't know if that was true and it didn't matter. Keep this line open. He turned to Sungmin. The barn. Both of them. Now. Sungmin was already moving. Dojin turned back to Cho. The old man was sitting at the table with the laptop and the glass of water, and the look of a man watching a plan he'd built for 11 years come apart in increments he hadn't engineered. Not because Dojin had outmaneuvered him, Cho had planned for most of this, had built contingencies for contingencies, but because the man he'd built those contingencies against had made different choices in the past 35 days than the man he'd been before them, and those different choices had changed the speed and direction of everything. Call them off, Dojin said. I can't, Cho said. They're not taking orders right now. They're executing a protocol that triggers automatically if contact is made at this location. It's not something I can cancel by phone. Dojin looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then he turned and moved toward the door. Cho's voice followed him. Kong, whatever you think of me, I wasn't going to hurt her. I was going to use the location for leverage. Just leverage. She was never... Dojin pushed through the farmhouse door into the cold night. He ran. Not the controlled movement of a man managing his appearance. He ran, flat out, across the dark Yangpyeong field toward the road where the vehicles waited, pulling out his phone to give Sungmin the signal and simultaneously trying to calculate the distance to Seoul against whatever head start Cho's team in the city had against Malcolm moving Nia through a building he didn't know as well as his own. The vehicle was moving before he'd fully closed the door. He had his phone pressed to his ear, and on the other end of the line, he could hear Malcolm's breathing, terse and controlled, and behind it the sound of movement, footsteps, a door, the particular acoustic of a stairwell, and then Nia's voice, closer than he expected, saying something in a low, urgent tone that wasn't fear, but wasn't calm either, the voice of a woman who had been told enough to know that moving fast was the correct response. Malcolm, Dojin said. We're on the second-floor landing, Malcolm said. Service stairs, she's moving. How many people on your team? 2 besides me. Position 1 at the ground floor service exit. Tell him nobody comes through that door except you and Naya. A pause, and then Malcolm relaying the instruction, and then, done. What's your vehicle situation? I have 1 car in the underground structure, registered to the building management company. Shouldn't be flagged. Take it. Don't call it in. Don't radio anyone. Get her into that car and drive. I'll give you a location. He thought for 3 seconds about what location was clean. Not Baeko operational, not anything Wu Chul had touched, nothing that had been within reach of the Cheongsu intelligence gathering. The Seongbuk Hospital. Go there directly. Tell them your sister is in active labor and get inside the building. You're harder to approach in a public medical facility. She's not in labor, Malcolm said. I know that. Get inside the building anyway. A sound on the line. A door opening. A change in acoustic from stairwell to parking structure. The sound of a car unlocking. Dojin counted the seconds. His vehicle was on the highway now, pushing past the speed that was safe and doing it anyway, the lights of Seoul visible in the distance like a low amber ceiling over the dark countryside. 40 minutes. Less if they pushed. But Cho's team had a 40-minute head start and were already in the city, and Dojin did not know how many people constituted their team, and he did not know what their protocol was, and he did not know what choices Malcolm would have to make if they reached the building before the car made it to the underground structure. These were the variables. He held them all simultaneously and kept his voice even. Malcolm, he said, talk to me. We're in the car, Malcolm said. She's in. We're moving. A pause, the engine sound changing as they pulled out of the parking structure. She wants to talk to you. Dojin closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Put her on, he said. A sound of the phone transferring and then Nia's voice. She sounded... He registered this with the specific attention of a man cataloging information he needs to be accurate about. Not terrified, tight, controlled. The way she sounded when she was handling something she hadn't planned for and was making decisions in real time. Dojin, she said. I'm here. Malcolm won't tell me exactly what's happening. I know. I'll tell you everything when you're safe. I'm 8 months pregnant in a car at 3 in the morning going to a hospital, she said, and underneath the tightness there was something that wasn't quite humor but was adjacent to it. The particular dark absurdity she'd always had a capacity to locate in terrible situations. I'd like some information. There are people who want to use your location to put pressure on me, he said. They know where you are. Malcolm is moving you somewhere harder to access. When you're inside, they can't reach you without doing something publicly visible, and that's not something they'll risk. A pause. Are they going to try to stop the car? I don't know, he said. Malcolm won't let that happen. You sound like you're moving fast. I'm coming toward you, he said. Another pause. He heard her breathe, the car sounds in the background, soul nighttime ambient filtering through. Dojin, she said. Yes. Our daughter is not coming tonight, she said. I need you to know that because you sound like you're catastrophizing, and I need you to be operational, not catastrophizing. Her voice was steady in a way he recognized as requiring effort. She's not coming tonight. Everything is fine with her. You focus on what you need to focus on. He pressed his thumb against the window glass. Okay, he said. Okay, she said back. Then quieter. Be careful. The phone transferred back to Malcolm before he could answer. They drove. The city came up fast, the outer districts, then the familiar density, the streets narrowing and complexifying. Sungmin had the police scanner running on low and was listening with the focused half-attention of a man trained to parse information from background noise. Dojin watched the city reappear around them and thought about Cho and the farmhouse and the barn team and the unknown size of the Seoul contingent and the gap between what he knew and what he needed to know that he was driving toward at 140 kilometers an hour. His phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. He answered. A voice he didn't recognize immediately, male, professional cadence, said, Mr. Kang, my name isn't important. What's important is that I'm standing in the lobby of a building in Seoul that your wife recently left, and I've been asked to relay a message. Dojin kept his voice completely flat. Relay it. Mr. Cho says the protocols can be suspended. He's offering to call them off, all of them, in exchange for the same terms he discussed with you tonight, plus one addition. What addition? He wants the organizational records from the first 3 years of your leadership, the voice said. The physical records, not digital copies. The books from before everything moved to encrypted servers. A pause. He says you know what he means. He says those records contain enough to end your organization entirely if released to the right authorities. He says he knows where they're stored and he's offering not to pursue them. Dojin was quiet. The first 3 years' physical records. They were in a storage location that only 4 people alive knew about. Dojin, Byung-soo, the attorney who had structured the early organization's financial filings, and one other person who had been present in the room when the storage decision was made 20 years ago. One other person who had been present, Cho Dae-sung. Of course he knew where they were. He wants the records and he'll suspend the protocols, Dojin said. Yes. Tell him no, Dojin said. A silence on the other end, then, Mr. Kang, tell him I said the records can burn before I hand them to him, Dojin said. Tell him the protocol suspension isn't a bargaining chip. It's a demand. He calls it off because what he's doing involves a pregnant woman, and it's not something I will negotiate around. And then tell him that if anything happens to my wife tonight, there is no version of this where he gets on a plane and lives quietly somewhere. His voice hadn't risen. It was the flattest it had been all night. That's the message. He ended the call. Sungmin turned to look at him from the front seat. The storage location, Sungmin said carefully. If Cho moves on it, he won't, Dojin said. Not tonight. He put everything into the contingency protocols. The storage location is a threat, not an active play. He doesn't have people positioned there, or they'd already have moved. And if you're wrong, Dojin looked at Seoul closing around the car. The hospital 2 minutes away, Malcolm's car, somewhere in this same city, moving through the same streets. Then I'm wrong, he said, and I deal with it. The car pulled into the hospital access road. Dojin was out before it fully stopped, moving through the main entrance without slowing for the sliding doors. And in the lobby, he took in the space in 1 second. The admissions desk, the night security, the cluster of plastic chairs near the far wall, the corridor leading to the emergency department. And then he saw Malcolm. Malcolm was standing against the far wall with the stillness of a man who had been in this position exactly long enough to know it was temporarily secure and that temporary was doing a lot of work. He was watching the entrance. When he saw Dojin, something in his posture recalibrated, not relaxing, but acknowledging. Beside Malcolm, seated in one of the plastic chairs, was Nia. She had her hands folded on top of her stomach, and she was watching the entrance with the same measured attention Malcolm was. And when Dojin came through the doors, she tracked him immediately. She looked tired in a way that went past tonight, the kind of tired that had been accumulating for weeks, and she looked entirely steady. Dojin crossed the lobby. Malcolm stepped aside. Not a deliberate move, just a small adjustment, a man making room without making a statement of it. Dojin crouched down in front of Nia's chair. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You ran," she said. "Yes," he said. 40 minutes from wherever you were." "Less," he said. She looked at his face for a long moment, at the dirt on his jacket, the set of his jaw, whatever was legible in his expression after the night he'd had. He looked back at her and let her read whatever was there, because he was done with the things he kept behind the mask. "Tell me who these people are," she said. "Someone from before you," he said. "Someone I handled badly a long time ago, who decided the response was to wait and build something designed to take everything from me." A pause. "He targeted you to get to me. That was the part I couldn't—" He stopped. "That was the part that ended the negotiation." "Is it handled?" she said. "The man is handled. The protocols he set in motion are still—" His phone was buzzing. He looked at it. Byung-soo. He stood and answered. "The barn team," Byung-soo said. "Both secured. And boss, the sole contingent. We have a location on them. They're stationary, hasn't moved in the past 20 minutes. "Where?" Byung-soo gave him an address. A building in Mapogu. Dojin ran the geography against what he knew about Cho's operational footprint, and it fit, close enough to the city center to move in either direction, far enough from any Byako operation to be invisible. "How many?" Dojin said. 3 vehicles, at least 8 people." 8. Against what he had in the city right now. The math was doable but not comfortable, and comfortable wasn't the point. The point was that 8 people who had just received a report from the barn that the barn team was silent were 8 people who were recalibrating whether the protocol was still viable. "They'll be weighing their options," Dojin said. "Yes," Byung-soo said. "And boss, I pulled the number that the barn made the call to. It traces to a burner, but the burner pinged off 2 towers before Mapogu, both towers in Incheon. Incheon. Cheongsu Logistics. Seorin's operational base, Seorin." Dojin looked across the hospital lobby at Malcolm, who was watching him with the focused, measuring attention of a man who understood that the person he was watching was currently making decisions that would determine whether the night ended one way or another. "Byung-soo," Dojin said. "Where is Seorin right now?" A pause. "Her building in Gangnam. Our man has eyes on. She hasn't moved." "No, but—" A pause. "Her lights went on 40 minutes ago." 40 minutes ago was approximately when the barn team had gone silent. Seorin had received a signal, not necessarily from the barn directly, but from somewhere in the chain that connected her to Cho's operation. And she had woken up and turned on her lights, and she was sitting in her apartment at 3:30 in the morning knowing that something had gone wrong. A woman who had spent months inside Cho's operational structure, who knew the account details and the logistics and the contacts, who had been the legitimate face that allowed the Cheongsu infrastructure to function without drawing attention. A woman who, if Cho's operation was coming apart, had a very significant and immediate problem of her own. Dojin thought about Seorin on the rooftop, almost like you have something to hide. The hand on his arm. The camera click. The professional precision of a woman who had executed her role in that encounter with the kind of competence that required either genuine conviction or genuine fear as a motivator. He thought about the fact that she had sent him a personal message apologizing for the photo. That apologies were not typically part of Cho's operational playbook. "Don't move on the Mapogu location yet," Dojin said. "And don't move on Seorin." A pause. "I need to make a call." He hung up. He stood in the hospital lobby at 3:30 in the morning, 40 meters from his estranged pregnant wife, 40 minutes from a farmhouse where an old man was being held by his people, with 8 of that old man's people stationary in Mapogu and the operational structure of 11 years of patient revenge beginning to fracture at its edges. And he took out his phone and dialed Yoon Seo-rin's personal number. She picked up on the first ring. The speed of it told him everything about how the night was going on her end. "Mr. Kang," she said. Her voice was tightly controlled, but the control was the kind that came from adrenaline, not composure. Underneath it was the specific frequency of a person who has been waiting for the worst possible call and has just received it. "You're awake," he said. "I've been awake," she said. "Tell me something," he said. "When Cho brought you into this, the negotiation, the photo, all of it, did he tell you what he was going to do with the woman?" A silence. 3 seconds. Long enough that he heard her breath change. "He said she wouldn't be hurt," Seo-rin said finally. "He said she was leverage, positioning, nothing physical." "She's 8 months pregnant," Dojin said. "She's been moved twice tonight through Seoul at 3 in the morning. You understand what kind of leverage that is?" Another silence. Longer. "I didn't know about tonight," Seo-rin said. "I knew the protocols existed. I didn't know they'd activate." "They activated because I found him faster than he planned," Dojin said. "And now you have a decision to make." He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, the apartment quiet behind it. "The Mapogu team," he said. "You know who commands them." She hesitated. Then, "Yes." "I need a name and a direct line," he said. "Someone those 8 people will actually take an order from, not Cho. Someone in the field chain." A pause that felt like a person standing at the edge of a decision they'd been approaching for some time and had perhaps already made before the phone rang. "If I give you that," she said slowly, "where does that leave me?" "In a significantly better position than you're in right now," Dojin said. "That's the honest answer." The silence stretched. In the lobby behind him, he heard Nia shift in her chair, heard Malcolm say something quiet to her, heard the hospital ambient, the distant PA system, the squeak of a floor being mopped somewhere, the ordinary insistent sounds of a building that dealt in emergencies and had learned to treat them as routine. "His name is Oh Kyung-sik," Seo-rin said. "He runs the field team. He answers to Cho, but Cho is—" She paused. "Cho isn't calling right now, is he?" "No," Dojin said. "Then Kyung-sik is trying to figure out what to do," she said. "He's disciplined, but he's not independent. If the command structure goes quiet, he holds position. He doesn't escalate without authorization." "Can you reach him?" A pause. The longest one. Dojin waited it out. "Yes," she said. "Then tell him to stand down and go home," Dojin said. "Tell him the operation is suspended. Tell him whatever you need to tell him that he'll believe from you." "And after you and I have a longer conversation," he said, "about what you know and what I need and what that's worth to both of us. But that conversation happens tomorrow, and it requires you to still be a person who made the right call tonight." He heard her exhale. A long, controlled breath that sounded like someone releasing something they'd been carrying since a rooftop at 11:30 on a rainy night. "I'll call him," she said. "Right now," Dojin said, "while I'm still on the line." And across the fragmented, sleepless city, in a farmhouse in Yangpyeong, and a hospital lobby in Seoul, and an apartment in Gangnam, and a parked vehicle cluster in Mapogu, and a dozen other locations that had become pieces of one man's 11-year design, things began, incrementally, and not without cost, to shift. Seo-rin made the call. Dojin stood in the hospital lobby and listened to her speak to Oh Kyung-sik in the flat, precise tone of someone delivering instructions that had already been decided, not discussed. She didn't explain. She didn't apologize or contextualize. She told Kyung-sik the operation was suspended by direct order, that all field teams were to disperse immediately, that any contact with Cho's network in the next 72 hours was to be considered unauthorized. She spoke for 90 seconds. When she finished, Kyung-sik asked one question that Dojin couldn't hear clearly, and Seo-rin said, "Because I'm telling you, that's enough," and ended the call. She came back on Dojin's line. "It's done," she said. "He'll comply." "He'll comply," she said. "He's not a true believer. He's a professional. Professionals read the room." A pause. "The room is very clear tonight." "Tomorrow afternoon," Dojin said. "My attorney's office. Bring everything you have from the Cheongsu structure. Accounts, contacts, the documentation Cho sent to my business partners. All of it. And in exchange, the conversation stays between us and the attorneys until we've established what your exposure is and what it isn't, he said. You cooperated tonight. That matters more than you think. She was quiet for a moment. I chose the wrong side, she said, not looking for absolution, just stating it. You chose the side that had the most organized offer at the time, Dojin said. That's a calculation error, not a character flaw. Tomorrow, we fix the calculation. He hung up. Byung-soo called 30 seconds later. The Mapogu vehicles were moving, dispersing, not advancing, the three cars pulling out in different directions without coordination, the behavior of people who had received a stand-down and were executing it without enthusiasm for what it meant about the chain of command they'd been working under. It's green, Byung-soo said. I know, Dojin said. Get some people to the farmhouse. Not aggressive, just presence. I want Cho held there until morning, and then I want him escorted to Incheon Airport. His choice of flight, his own documents, no interference. Just confirmation that he boards. You're still letting him leave. He gave me everything on the laptop, Dojin said. Accounts, contacts, the full structure. And the documentation he sent to the business partners. I have the counter-argument in his own records. We can clean it up. A pause. He's 64 years old, Byung-soo. He spent 11 years, and whatever he had left, building something that didn't work. That's its own sentence. Byung-soo was quiet for a moment. Yes, boss. Dojin put his phone in his jacket pocket. He turned around. Nia was watching him from the plastic chair with the steady attention she'd had on him since he'd come through the hospital doors. She'd been listening to his end of the calls, not pretending otherwise, not looking away. Beside her, Malcolm stood with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who was recategorizing information in real time. Dojin walked back to them and crouched down again in front of Nia's chair, which put him below her eye level, and he stayed there. It's handled, he said. The people in the cars, she said. Dispersed. The man behind it. He'll be on a plane by morning. He looked at her face. I'll explain everything. Not here, not tonight, but everything. She looked at him for a long time. Not with warmth, not yet. With the particular attention of a woman who had spent months recalibrating what she believed and was still doing that work and wasn't going to stop it just because the night had been terrifying. She was going to look at him clearly. That was who she was. He'd known it when he married her and he'd failed to honor it, and now it was the thing he valued most and was the least sure he deserved. You came, she said. Yes. 40 minutes, less. I drove fast. Something moved in her face. Not a smile, the possibility of one, sitting behind the exhaustion and the careful restraint of a woman who had not made any decisions and was not going to be pushed into making them by adrenaline or relief. I'm tired, she said. I want to go somewhere and sleep. Malcolm's location, Dojin said. Tonight it's secure. The people who had it were Cho's people, and they're gone. Tomorrow I'll find somewhere better. Malcolm cleared his throat. Dojin looked up at him. There's a property I maintain in Bundang, Malcolm said. Under my own name, nothing to do with any of this. She can stay there. He paused. You can come during the day, if she wants. It was the most Malcolm had offered him since any of this began. Dojin recognized it for what it was. Not forgiveness, not endorsement, but a man who had watched the night unfold and updated his assessment by the specific margin the night had earned. Thank you, Dojin said. Malcolm nodded once, the way men nod when they've said what they meant and don't need to add to it. They left the hospital at 4:15 in the morning, Nia moving carefully through the lobby with the deliberate gait of a woman who was 8 months pregnant and had been awake for hours and was not going to let any of that be visible if she could help it. Dojin walked beside her without touching her, close enough to be present, far enough to let her set the distance. When they reached the door and the night air came in, she stopped for a second and he stopped with her. She breathed the cold air in. I missed the smell of regular nighttime, she said, not to him specifically, or maybe to him entirely. Your penthouse is too high up. You don't get the street smell. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and she walked through the door, and he followed. Cho Dae-sung boarded a flight to Lisbon at 7:40 in the morning. Byung-soo confirmed it with a 2-word text, he's on. Dojin read it in the parking lot of a convenience store in Bundang, where he'd stopped to buy coffee, and the specific brand of peanut butter pretzels Nia had once mentioned she preferred because the Bundang property wouldn't have her things, and she hadn't eaten since before midnight, and he needed to do something concrete with his hands. He sat in the car with the coffee and the pretzels and the confirmation text, and he let the night finish draining out of him. It took longer than he expected. The operational part had been running on the specific cold fuel of emergency, and it didn't just switch off. It metabolized slowly, leaving behind something that was tired in ways that went past the body. He'd been awake for 26 hours. He'd sat across from his old mentor in a farmhouse in Yangpyeong and heard him say, "I built you," and hadn't disagreed with it, and that was still sitting in him unresolved, the way things that are true but uncomfortable take longer to process than things that are simply difficult. He thought about what Dr. Han would say about tonight. She'd probably say something inconvenient about the relationship between the things Cho had accused him of, absorbing people, using their capacity and discarding them, and the things he was actively trying to change about himself. She'd probably draw a line between the boy in Do Bonggu, who believed that power was the only way to not be left, and the 42-year-old man who had built an organization that functioned on exactly that principle at scale. She'd probably be right. He picked up his phone and sent her a message. "I need to move our Thursday session to Friday, if possible. Something happened last night that I'd like to talk through." He knew she wouldn't read it until morning office hours. He sent it anyway, because 3 months ago he would not have thought to send it, and the fact that he thought to send it was evidence of something. He drove back to the Bundang property. Malcolm opened the door. He'd been awake, clearly had not slept, though he'd sent Nia to the bedroom and was drinking coffee at the kitchen table with the quiet alertness of a man who had transitioned from operational mode to watch mode and was comfortable in both. He looked at the coffee Dojin was carrying and the bag of pretzels, and something moved briefly in his expression before settling. "She's asleep," Malcolm said. "Good." Dojin set the coffee and pretzels on the kitchen table. "I need to tell you what happened tonight, all of it, so you understand what was done and what the exposure was and what isn't exposure anymore." Malcolm gestured at the chair across from him. Dojin sat. He talked for 40 minutes. Cho's history, the 3 years of Wuchul's cooperation, the Cheongsu infrastructure, Seorin's role, the contingency protocols, the farmhouse conversation, Seorin's call to Kyung-sik. He told Malcolm about the townhouse address being compromised and the therapy clinic, and the law firm thread that had led to Nia's building location. He told it without softening any of the parts that reflected badly on him. The surveillance detail he'd had on Nia before she left. The organizational decisions that had made Wuchul feel like cooperation with Cho was a rational option. The fact that he'd built something powerful enough to make his own wife a target just by being connected to him. Malcolm listened without interrupting. He held his coffee with both hands and looked at the table while Dojin talked and only looked up at specific points. The townhouse address, the therapy clinic, the moment Dojin described running across the Yangpyeong field. When Dojin finished, Malcolm was quiet for a while. "The man's on a plane," Malcolm said finally. "Yes, and the woman, Seorin. She comes in tomorrow afternoon with everything she has from the Cheongsu structure. Then we see what she knows and what she was, and whether there's a version of this where she's an asset instead of a liability. You trust her." "I trust that she made a calculation tonight that was in her own interest," Dojin said, "which means she's predictable when her interests are legible. That's more reliable than trust." Malcolm absorbed this. "That's a very particular way to look at people." "I'm aware of that," Dojin said. Malcolm looked at him then, a direct level look that didn't blink away. "My sister left because you stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as part of the infrastructure," he said. "I'm saying that because it's connected to what you just said, and you seem to be in a mood to hear things you don't want to hear." Dojin met his eyes. "I know." "You going to therapy?" "Twice a week." "Is it doing the thing it's supposed to do?" Dojin thought about Dr. Han asking him what he wanted. The first time anyone had asked him that in a decade. The way he'd answered without planning to, and surprised himself. "I think so," he said. Slowly. Malcolm set down his coffee. "She hasn't decided anything," he said. "About you. About what comes next. I need you to understand that before you walk into that room." A pause. "She's glad you came last night. She didn't say that, but I know my sister, and she's glad you came. That isn't the same as having decided." "I know," Dojin said. I'm not here to push her toward anything. Then why are you here? The question was direct and deserved a direct answer. Because she hasn't eaten since before midnight and someone should have brought her something, Dojin said. And because I needed to tell you what happened tonight. And because... He stopped. Because the alternative to being here was being somewhere else, and I didn't want to be somewhere else. Malcolm looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood up, picked up the bag of pretzels, and put them in the kitchen cabinet. She likes them better at room temperature, he said. They've been in a cold car. He picked up his coffee. I'm going to sleep for 2 hours in the back room. Don't wake her up. He walked out. Dojin sat at the kitchen table alone in the quiet Bundong apartment and listened to the buildings settle around him, the small creaks and ambient sounds of a structure built for ordinary habitation, and looked at his hands on the table and thought about the boy in Dobonggu and the man in Yangpyeong and all the distance between them and whether distance was the right word for it or whether cost was closer. I was still at the table when Nia came out. He didn't know what time it was exactly. Late morning, the light through the windows had changed from gray to the flat white of an overcast Seoul day. He'd dozed briefly in the chair and woken up with his neck at an angle that would hurt later, and had been sitting with cold coffee and the specific emptiness of a man waiting for something he wasn't sure he had a right to wait for. She came out of the bedroom in the gray, oversized cardigan, not the same one from the night 8 months ago in the penthouse kitchen, but the same kind. She'd always worn them in the mornings, and she stopped when she saw him, not surprised exactly, but registering. Malcolm let you stay, she said. He said not to wake you. She looked at him sitting at the table with the cold coffee and the circles under his eyes, and the dirt still on the cuff of his jacket that he hadn't noticed in the dark. You look terrible, she said. I've had a long night. She went to the kitchen and found the pretzels in the cabinet and opened them and stood at the counter eating them and looking at him. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had been good at it for 20 years for the wrong reasons and was trying to figure out how to be good at it for different ones. Tell me about the man, she said. The one who was behind it. He told her about Cho. Not the operational details. She'd heard enough of those. He told her the human version, the mentor, the accounts, the conversation at 29 where he'd made an offer instead of making an example. He told her what Cho had said in the farmhouse, I built you, and what was true in it. Nia ate pretzels and listened without comment until he'd finished. He wasn't wrong, she said, that you absorbed people. No, Dojin said, he wasn't wrong. You did it to me too, she said. Not the same way. But I stopped being a person to you at some point and became part of how you organized your life. She looked at the pretzels in her hand. The furniture thing I said, in the kitchen, that night. I remember. I meant it, she said. I wasn't trying to be cruel, I was trying to tell you something true. I know, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The apartment was still. Outside, a car passed on the street below with the ordinary sound of a Tuesday morning, people going places they needed to go. I found out 2 days after I left, she said, that the surveillance detail you had on me had been running for 2 years. She looked at him directly. Park Sung-min told me. Indirectly, but I understood what he was telling me. A pause. You never told me. No, Dojin said. I didn't. Because you knew I'd be angry. Because I told myself it was for your protection, and I didn't want to have the conversation where you told me that the decision to protect you like that wasn't mine to make alone, he said. It came out more clearly than he expected. Dr. Han's language, or something close to it. The practiced articulation of things he'd been turning over in sessions. I was right that you would have said that, and I was wrong to avoid it. Nia set the pretzels on the counter and looked at him for a long time. You're different, she said. I'm trying to be. I don't mean that as a compliment necessarily, she said. I mean I can hear it. Something's different in how you're talking, what you're saying. She tilted her head. The therapy. Twice a week, he said. Since the conditions. Is it hard? Yes, he said, without hesitation. What's the hardest part? He thought about Dr. Han asking him what he wanted, and the answer that had come up unexpected. He thought about the session where she'd said, part of you chose someone who would tell you the truth, and he'd sat in his car for 20 minutes afterward. Being honest about what I wanted when I built everything, he said. The real reason. Not power, not safety. The reason underneath those. He looked at his hands. I wanted to never be left again. And I built something that guaranteed I would be, eventually, by anyone who loved me enough to be honest. The room was quiet. Nia's hand moved to her stomach, the automatic gesture, the one she made without knowing she made it. He'd learned to recognize it over months of watching her, the way she touched the baby when she was processing something that mattered. I'm not coming back, she said. Not to the penthouse. Not to what we were. I know, he said. I'm not saying never, she said carefully. I'm saying not to what we were. Because what we were wasn't working, and I'm not interested in going back to it. She met his eyes. I'm also not saying the door is closed. I'm saying the door opens on something different if it opens at all. And different means you've actually changed, not that you've managed a situation well. I understand the difference, he said. Do you? I think the difference is that managing a situation well is what I've always done, he said. Changing means I'm doing the work regardless of whether it gets me what I want. It means I show up to the visits and I go to therapy and I learn every habit she has because that's the right thing to do, not because it's strategy. Nia looked at him. He held her gaze and let her look. She, Nia said softly. Our daughter, he said. Naomi. The name he'd suggested months ago, half joking at the kitchen table in the penthouse, when they'd been going through lists, and she'd said it needed to be something that worked in both languages. She'd written it down and circled it. Something moved in Nia's face. You remembered, she said. I remember everything, he said. That's always been the problem. She almost laughed. It wasn't a laugh. It was the edge of one, pulling at the corner of her mouth before she brought it back. But he saw it. He'd spent 35 days without seeing it, and now he saw it and looked at it the way you look at something you nearly lost and still might, because you've learned the cost of not paying attention. You can come to the appointments, she said. If you want, the remaining ones. I want, he said. And when she comes, she paused, a breath. I need you there. Not because I've made any decisions about us. Because she needs to come into the world with her father there. She looked at him steadily. Can you be there without making it about anything else? Yes, he said. Just be her father. Just that. Just that, he said. Nodded once. Then she picked up the pretzels again and ate one and looked out the window at the flat Seoul morning, and Dojin sat at the table and breathed and didn't try to say anything more, because some moments were complete without addition. Naomi Kong was born 18 days later on a Tuesday at 4:50 in the afternoon. The labor was 11 hours. Dojin arrived at the hospital at 7 in the morning when Malcolm called, and he sat in the waiting room for 4 hours without his phone, without his people, without any of the infrastructure that usually surrounded him, because Nia had said she needed him there without any of that, and he'd meant it when he said he understood. Malcolm sat with him for the first 2 hours. They didn't talk much. At one point, Malcolm said, "It takes as long as it takes," and Dojin said, "I know," and Malcolm said, "I'm just saying so you don't try to manage it," and Dojin almost smiled. At 2 in the afternoon, a nurse came out and said things were progressing and it would be another 2 to 3 hours. Malcolm brought coffee from downstairs, bad hospital coffee in paper cups. Dojin drank it without comment because it was there and it was hot, and those were the only criteria that mattered. At 4:30, the nurse came back and said it was close. Dojin was allowed in at 4:42. He didn't know what to do with his hands when he came through the door. He'd known intellectually what labor looked like, but the reality of her, exhausted and present and entirely focused on the work of what was happening, was different from knowing it. He went to the side of the bed where the nurse pointed, and he stood there. And Nia looked at him for 1 second in the way she'd looked at him across the kitchen counter all those weeks ago, with the absolute truth of her eyes. And then she looked away because she had other things to do. He stood beside her. He held her hand when she reached for it. I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that was more than what was already happening, and he was learning, slowly and at considerable cost, to let what was already happening be enough. Naomi came into the world at 4:50 in the afternoon screaming, which the nurses said was exactly right, and they put her in Nia's arms while Dojin stood at the side of the bed and looked at his daughter for the first time. She was red-faced and furious and impossibly small, her fists clenched against her chest, her eyes not yet open, and she was the most specific and real thing he had ever seen in his life. Every other thing he'd built, the organization, the territory, the 20 years of careful construction, went distant. Not disappeared, not resolved, just very far away, on the other side of a window he'd stepped back from. Nia held her for a long time. Dojin watched Nia's face during this and thought he had never in his life understood the word love to mean what it meant right now in this room. Then Nia looked up at him. "Do you want to hold her?" she said. He'd ordered executions without flinching. He'd sat across from Cho Dae-sung at 2 in the morning and not blinked. He had spent 20 years being the person in the room that nothing moved. His hand shook when he took Naomi. Genuinely shook, small, uncontrollable tremors in both hands, as the nurse helped him position his arms, and the impossible weight of her settled against his chest. 7 pounds of human being who had no knowledge of any of the things he'd done or tried to do or been. She turned her head slightly against his chest, the instinctive movement of a creature new to the world and already searching for something warm. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. He didn't cry loudly. It wasn't like that. It was quieter, the kind that comes from somewhere below performance, below awareness almost, the kind you don't know is happening until it's already on your face. He stood holding his daughter and felt it happen and didn't try to stop it and didn't look at anyone else in the room. He didn't deserve this. He knew that completely. He was standing in a room where he did not deserve to be, holding something that was not the product of anything he'd earned, and the only response he had that was honest was this. He would spend whatever time he had becoming worth the trust of a person who weighed 7 pounds and didn't know his name yet. The court agreements stayed in place. He hadn't expected them to change, and he didn't ask. He showed up to every supervised visit without bodyguards, without his phone, without a single person on his payroll anywhere in the vicinity. He sat on the floor of whatever space they'd arranged and held Naomi and learned her. He learned that she made a specific sound before she cried, a small intake of breath with a particular pitch that gave him a 3-second window to redirect her attention and sometimes prevent it entirely. He learned that she responded to humming in a way she didn't respond to singing, and that old Korean songs worked better than anything else, songs his grandmother had sung in the Dobonggu apartment that he'd thought he'd forgotten and discovered he hadn't. He learned that she watched his face with an attention that was startling for something so new, the focused tracking of a creature trying to understand whether a presence was safe. He held still when she did it. He let her look. He told Dr. Han about it, about holding still and letting her look. Dr. Han said, "That's different from what you usually do with your face." "I know," he said. "What's different about it?" "I'm not managing what she sees," he said. He stopped. "I'm just there." Dr. Han wrote something and looked up. "That's the work," she said simply. He went to every session. He never missed one, not during the Cheongsu dissolution, which took 3 months of careful legal and financial work, Seorin's cooperation making it faster and cleaner than it might have been, and not during the business partner damage control, which required several uncomfortable conversations with men who had received Cho's fabricated documentation and needed to be shown the counter-evidence without being shown too much about how the organization actually functioned. He went during all of it, because Dr. Han had said early that the work didn't pause for operational reality, and he'd believed her, and it turned out to be true. The Baco syndicate contracted, not collapsed. He hadn't let it collapse, and didn't want to, and was honest with himself about why, which was its own ongoing project. But it contracted significantly. The Eastern Territory revenue stream reduced after the port disruption, 2 legitimate business partnerships suspended. Pending the documentation fallout, the Cheongsu logistics infrastructure dismantled and absorbed or dissolved. What remained was leaner and more controlled, which Byung-soo said made it stronger and Dojin said made it smaller, and they were both right in ways that didn't contradict each other. Woo Chul resigned for health reasons. His son's business continued without incident. Dojin received a single text from Woo Chul 3 months after the Yangpyeong night that read, "I'm sorry." He read it, closed it, and didn't respond because he wasn't sure yet what responding would mean, and he'd learned from a 53-year-old psychiatrist that sitting with uncertainty was not the same as avoiding it. Seo-rin turned out to be, as Dojin had suspected, primarily a person who had made a calculation error. Her cooperation with the Cheongsu dissolution was complete and professionally delivered, and she asked for nothing beyond the protection she'd been offered. She dissolved her nightclub operation, refiled her business registration under a different structure, and 6 months later opened a legitimate event consulting firm that had no connection to anything Dojin touched. He heard about it from Hyun-soo, who tracked such things as a professional habit. He noted it and moved on. Cho Dae-sung sent nothing from Lisbon. Dojin did not expect him to. He was confirmed by Byung-soo's international contacts as living in a residential district outside the city, in a property he'd purchased through a now-dissolved financial entity. Living quietly. Not rebuilding, just living, with whatever 11 years of construction and its ultimate failure had left him. Dojin thought about him sometimes, not with anger, which was gone, not with forgiveness, which was too large and too clean a word, with something more complicated, the kind of reckoning you do with a person who taught you things you still use and hurt you in ways you're still sorting through, and you can't separate those two facts without losing the truth of both. He thought about what Cho had said about being built into something and then discarded. And he thought about Nia's word, absorbed. And he thought about Naomi's eyes tracking his face, checking whether the presence was safe. These things were related. He didn't have the full language for how, but Dr. Han was patient and they were working on it. Naomi's first birthday arrived on a Tuesday in autumn. The garden behind Dojin's townhouse in Seongbuk-dong was the kind of small urban garden that doesn't photograph particularly well, but is warm in the way of things that have been tended. He'd planted things in the spring, not because he'd ever gardened, but because there was a patch of dirt behind the townhouse that Nia had looked at once during a supervised visit, and said that could be something, and he'd taken that as information. He'd asked the nursery worker what grew reliably in partial shade in Seoul. She'd told him. He'd bought what she recommended and put it in the ground and watered it on a schedule. By October, it was unremarkable and alive, which was better than either alternative. The gathering was small. Malcolm brought a colleague who apparently handled security logistics and spent most of the afternoon at the garden's edge being professionally pleasant. Dr. Han had not been invited. She was his psychiatrist, not his friend, a distinction she had been clear about. But Dojin thought about her while he set up the folding table, because the afternoon would not have been possible without the work done in the chair across from her. Nia arrived at 2 o'clock, with Naomi in a carrier against her chest, which Naomi had recently decided was the acceptable transport method, and all others were subject to revision. Nia looked rested in a way she hadn't for most of the previous year, the specific rest of a person who had made decisions and settled into them, even when the decisions were hard and unfinished. She looked, Dojin thought, like herself. The version he'd first known, and then spent 2 years slowly failing to see. He held Naomi while Nia ate, which Naomi tolerated with the provisional acceptance of a 1-year-old who had recently learned that her father would hum if prompted, and this was an acceptable feature. He hummed. Naomi put her hand against his jaw, the way she'd started doing in the past few weeks. Small fingers spread, checking the vibration of sound, apparently finding it interesting enough to repeat. He held still and let her check. Malcolm watched this from across the garden with the expression of a man who was not going to say what he was thinking, which Dojin had learned to read as the closest thing to approval that Malcolm extended. Later, in the afternoon, when Naomi had eaten cake with focused intensity and been thoroughly cleaned and placed on a blanket on the grass in the pale autumn sun, she made her first serious attempt at standing. She'd done it before, pulled up on furniture, on Dojin's knee, on the coffee table at Nia's apartment during visits. But this was different, the unsupported version, the actual commitment to vertical. She got her feet under her with the specific determination of someone who had decided that this time was the time, and she rose and wobbled, and for 2 seconds was entirely upright and surprised by it. Dojin and Nia both moved at the same moment. Not a coordinated decision, just the same instinct, toward the same small person, from either side. They crouched at the same time and their hands met in the grass between them, both reaching for the same stable point, and neither pulled away. Naomi looked at them. At his face, then her face, then the place where their hands were, with the focused, interested look of a person encountering a new arrangement of things she recognized. Then she sat down heavily on the grass and reached for the edge of the blanket instead. Dojin looked at his hand, at Nia's hand beside it in the grass. Nia looked at the same thing. "She's going to be walking in a week," Nia said. "I know," he said. She does the face right before she commits, Nia said. You can see her decide. I know, he said. I've been watching for it. Nia turned and looked at him with the directness she'd always had, that he'd always found simultaneously clarifying and uncomfortable. You're here, she said. Yes, he said. Every visit, every appointment. She paused. Malcolm told me you sat in the hospital waiting room for 4 hours without your phone before she was born. It was the right thing to do. I know it was, she said. I'm not complimenting you for doing the right thing. I'm saying I saw it. She looked at Naomi on the blanket. I'm saying it matters to me that I saw it. He waited. I'm not ready, she said. I need you to hear that and believe it and not try to change it, because the moment you try to manage it is the moment I know nothing has changed. I hear it, he said. I believe it. I'm also not... She stopped, looked at her hands in the grass. I'm also not where I was a year ago, which is a different thing from ready. She glanced at him sideways, the particular look he'd learned to recognize as honesty costing something. I'm somewhere in between, which is where I'm going to be for a while, and I need that to be okay. It's okay, he said. You're not managing that answer. No, he said. I'm not. She looked at him for a moment more. Then she turned back to Naomi, who had located a leaf and was examining it with profound scientific interest. She has your hands, Nia said. Dojin looked at Naomi's hands. The small fingers turned around the leaf. He supposed Nia was right. She has your focus, he said. Nia almost laughed. It was closer to a laugh this time. That's going to be a problem in about 3 years. Probably, he said. They sat in the garden in the autumn afternoon with their daughter between them, and the silence of people who had been through something together and were still in it and had stopped pretending that simple endings were available to complicated people. The wounds were there. He was not going to pretend they weren't. She was not going to pretend either, because that was not who she was. And him understanding and honoring who she was had to come before anything else. But they were there, in the same garden, watching the same child turn a leaf over and over in her hands as if it contained something worth understanding. That evening, after everyone had gone and Dojin had cleaned up the garden and the folding table and found one of Naomi's socks, inexplicably, in the rose bushes, he sat on the back step alone in the dark and put his hand in his jacket pocket. The letter wasn't there. He'd moved it 3 weeks ago. Not thrown away, never that, but transferred from his jacket to the drawer in his nightstand because he'd been carrying it long enough that it had become performance rather than reminder. He'd taken it out and read it one last time and put it in the drawer and told himself he needed to stop holding it as evidence and start holding it as history. Our daughter deserves a father who shows up. He was showing up. Not perfectly. Not without the ongoing work of being someone who examined his defaults and chose against them when the defaults were wrong. Not without the twice-weekly sessions and the effort of articulating in plain language what he'd spent decades building walls around. But he was showing up. Without strategy, without management, just there, in a garden in Seongbuk-dong, that was ordinary and tended and alive, because Nia had looked at a patch of dirt and said that could be something, and he'd believed her. He looked up at the dark Seoul sky above the Seongbuk-dong rooftops and breathed the cold autumn air and did not need to hold a letter to know what it said, because he knew it the way he knew his daughter's pre-cry sound and the specific pitch of humming that made her still and the exact weight of 7 pounds, shifting to trust against his chest. The empire was still there, smaller and different and still his, and he was still the person who ran it, and those things were true, and he had stopped pretending they weren't. And underneath them, holding more than any of them, was a man who had learned the hard way that the thing most worth protecting was not the thing he'd spent 20 years building. It was the thing that had looked at him in a hospital garden with serious eyes and reached for his finger when the world was too much. And it was the woman in the garden this afternoon who had looked at their daughter and said, "She has your hands," like it was just an ordinary observation, like his hands were worth inheriting. He didn't take that for granted. He intended never to take it for granted again. He went inside and turned on the lights and started learning how to live in an ordinary house like an ordinary man, which was the hardest thing Kang Dojin had ever attempted, and the only thing, in the end, that had ever truly been worth the effort,